Hello and welcome to the CFB Super Show. I'm your host, Walter Waddell, aka Dub Deuces 85, aka all that other stuff that I like to say. Brought to you, of course, by the world famous FTN Network. Man, that NFL money coming through is real nice. Our NFL team has been crushing it, and it's up to me and all of my counterparts in the niche community to do our part and have ourselves a massive, massive week. And I think we're going to do that. We started off really well today on that Coastal Carolina showdown. The ballsy Grayson McCall fade that some of us ran worked out, hoping to carry that into tomorrow's 4-gamer. And then, of course, this weekend, huge stuff going on. So we got to pull our weight because that NFL team of ours, man, they're absolutely crushing it. As we go into week 4, I want to be able to see lots of green screens throughout. I am flying solo tonight. No Jake Kuchek, no co-host, no, reaching back into my past, grabbing Pete Cole or any of the other, guys that I've hung out with through the years. It's just a solo Dub Deuces show. And I'm already pretty long-winded. Like, if anyone can, there's some people in this industry who can talk, right? Like, there's people who can talk, but I can talk. And if I do a full game-by-game breakdown with how I normally give analysis, we'll be here all night. And, as much as I love to sit here and talk for like 7 hours about this stuff, I don't think you guys want to hear me talk about that stuff for 7 hours. So even with YouTube having the speed up, times 1,000 option, which I know a lot of you watch me on that already. So what we're going to do is still go with the tried and true method of game-by-game, because I still feel like that's the most beneficial to you guys as digesting this content. And the whole position by position thing, it works okay for written content, but for shows, I still feel like game by game is a little bit easier to go through. And I also I seem to promise you guys every week that I'm going to do timestamps. I will do timestamps for this show, but I'm going to do summaries of each game. So I'm still going to give you that same hard-hitting analysis that you're used to. But because I don't have a co-host here to split the games up with me, I can't get into each one super in-depth. So I'm going to have to go a little bit quicker than normal and really kind of get down to the meat and potatoes and kind of run through here. If you're watching live, I definitely appreciate that. Feel free to interact in the chat. I will check that periodically if you have any questions. As usual, we still have, of course, the Live Before Lock show coming up on Saturday morning, 8 a.m. PST. 11 a.m. EST. That'll be 1 hour before lock to answer any last-minute questions, injury news, lineup stuff, like all that last-minute stuff we'll do. And content-wise, there's a ton of stuff coming through the pipeline. We'll have my prop article coming out tomorrow over on the FTN bet side. We'll also have an Ohio State game breakdown with any bets that I like there. The Friday slate breakdown, of course, the main slate for Saturday, which will be out tomorrow evening, and then Saturday, afternoon, we'll have that night slate right up. So there's tons of content coming out for me. Still got to work the day job for now, but FCN's going to the moon, and I'm very excited about that. So lots going on here. Let's check in with the chat here. Hope you guys can have some insight into A&M and Auburn. Yeah, that one's going to, it's cliche to say, but I feel like that one's going to be a better real life game than fantasy. There'll be some fantasy goodness in there. There's some plays in there. We'll talk about it, but that one's definitely difficult. You know what, Alex, I could absolutely take it all the way to lock. I could have you on here giving your NC State insider info, and we could just talk about, reminisce about Markel Johnson and Devin Daniels and some other, good times there that we've had with the pack. But, the show's got to go on. We'll save that for another day. Let's jump right into the first game on the slate here. And, of course, it's going to be primarily DraftKings focused. I will reference FanDuel as best as I can. At the end of the show, I'll give my 3-man DraftKings core, 3-man FanDuel core, and then also kind of jump into the PrizePicks side of thing. I want to look at some of the feedback we got was we were giving some numbers that we got earlier in the day, and some of those had changed. So I am going to look at the board, the most current version of the board, and give you guys plays I like right off of that. And then if we have any time, big if, We'll look and see if there's any prop stuff that I'm going to look at, but the article will be out tomorrow, and it's typically free, so you can check out any of my prop stuff that I like. Actually running pretty well with the every day, the anytime touchdown bets. We've been running pretty clean on those ever since week 0. I think 3 of our first 4 have hit, so we're going to keep going for those anytime touchdowns and see if we can keep that streak going. All right, first game on the slate here for DraftKings, Florida State versus Clemson. 2.5-point favorites are the Seminoles, a 55 total. Some of the totals on the slate are pretty high. We're going to have probably a pretty high scoring slate overall. Pricing, while improving, still not quite to the level where it needs to be. So expect, to get punished for any like major bust that you have in your lineup. There'll be some chalk that hits. There'll be some chalk that whiffs. Some of the chalk we got away from last week with Braylon Allen. I know he ended up doing pretty well in the second half, but that could have been a lot worse. We actually had some pretty decent calls between Jake and I, but there was just a little bit left to be desired there. It wasn't the greatest slate ever, but we did have a nice secondary slate on the night slate and a nice late night slate was especially good, typically is, and that one's going to be fun this weekend as well. Anyways, lots of high-scoring stuff going on. Florida State versus Clemson. Now, the Clemson side is not that exciting to me. I do think we'll see a little bit of ownership here just because you're going to hear a bit of parroting going on. And I don't say that to be negative towards anybody. I'm not talking about anyone directly. It's just that I know that there's going to be a lot of Will Shipley's too cheap. Will Shipley's too cheap. And that talk's going to, over the next 48 hours, it's really going to fester to the level where we're going to see Will Shipley ownership probably start to balloon to a level that I don't feel all that great about. They haven't really used him in the way that we thought he would be used, like, from the past. He hasn't, scored any rushing touchdowns yet. He did have the receiving touchdown in that week 1 game against Duke where they just got outplayed massively. Obviously, they've had some pretty easier opponents since then, but just the 19 total carries in the past 2 games. He has been targeted a fair amount in the passing game. Does have 11 receptions for 58 yards and that touchdown. That's where a lot of the PPR stuff comes into play for Shipley, to where even if he churns out 50 yards on the ground, he's typically going to have 5-6 targets in the game. This game against FSU, they're definitely going to need to use him. The Heisman talk of Cade Klubnik has kind of died down now, as it should. But you look at, how well he's played the last couple of games. Maybe it's going to get, talked back up there. But against a better opponent, I don't know that Klubnik's going to be able to have the kind of time he's been seeing. And I think a lot of dump offs to Will Shipley make a lot of sense, honestly. So I could see the Shipley play being the one where by the time we roll into lock on Saturday, we see him kind of sneak into the top 5 for ownership at the position. I don't love him as a play, but I don't mind him either. So at 5.7, that's okay. Running backs, typically a strength of the FTN, CBB or CFB Super Show. Our running back group hasn't quite hit the way that we're accustomed to. But as we get into week 4 here, I feel like we're going to be dialed in to the running back group. And Will Shipley's kind of a fringe play for me at this moment. Nobody else on Clemson for me. I'm not using Klubnik. I was never on the Heisman train there for him. 7.3 is an interesting price. This one turns into a semi shootout. Like I said, it is a bit of a higher total there at 55. I certainly don't hate that, but I think Shipley's really where we want to look at here. And as far as the receivers go, we're going to have some other cheap options we can look at. Bo Collins 4.9, Antonio Williams 5.2. These are all playable, but I feel like later in the season when we're kind of hard up for value, prices have ballooned on a lot of these other guys. That's when we might look into a range like this for these guys. As of right now, I don't think we need to go in that direction. On the FSU side, I do think Jordan Travis is interesting because of the fact that he's 9.4. People aren't going to be looking to pay that price tag for him. It is, like I said, a fairly decent game for scoring. We've only seen him in the LSU game, really just completely tear it up, scored a rushing touchdown, threw 4 touchdowns. The week after that in a blowout wasn't needed as much, so his score went down. But then in a close game against BC, which ended up being way, way closer than we thought it would be, weather be damned, only completed 66% of his 24 pass attempts, 2 touchdowns, rushed a little bit for 38 yards, but really didn't get a whole lot going on there. I do think we see, even in a tough road environment, Travis play really well. I think we see him eclipse 30 pass attempts. And I also think that we see him, probably churn out somewhere between 35 and 50 yards. if he scores on the ground, throws 3 touchdowns, 9.4 price tag's not going to really be a problem. And I don't foresee any ownership there. It is a bit nerve-wracking though. It's one of the first set of the early games there. If he does only put up a 20, you're kind of be chasing the rest of the day. It kind of, puts a damper on the rest of your main slate. So I typically don't like to take game time into effect here, but there's a lot of mental with this, right? And I just don't want to be tied into him at 9.4 in my main, but I absolutely love him in GPP situation because I just think he'll be sub 5%, and he absolutely could be a top 3 scorer at the position. Running backs wise on FSU, Trey Benson, a ton of hype. When Treshaun Ward transferred out, all we heard was, Trey Benson's he's going to be a breakout star. He's going to be a top 3 running back. Hasn't quite worked out that way. In week 2, lesser opponent, he did have a monster game, 3 rushing touchdowns, but you see, he's only had the 79 yards. Granted, he only had 9 carries. We haven't seen that big workload just yet against BC last week. 14 carries for 68 yards and a touchdown. Did have a reception. He's been targeted pretty consistently. 6.8 is just a little bit too high for me. Toafili he's still factoring in just like he has in years past. Even when they had Treshaun Ward, like Toafili's going to be in there for 3 to 9 carries. Just like no more, no less. He's going to have some receptions. It's not enough to play him. It's 5.4 anyways, but it's enough to really negatively affect Trey Benson and his production and being able to play him. So I don't think we can really viably play either of those running backs in good conscience. It just doesn't feel like a very good play. The buzz term that I've been using a lot is gross negligence. It's not quite to that level of gross negligence, but it's definitely getting close. I love seeing all the Keon Coleman hype. He's clearly the top dog, the guy we'd want to use. If we want anybody from Florida State, it's Keon Coleman. Now, he doesn't have the target lead. That goes to Johnny Wilson, who leads the team in targets with 21, 11 catches for 209 yards. Wilson, he's been great. But Keon Coleman, come on. 20 targets, 12 catches, 170 yards, 4 touchdowns. He is just a mammoth. And you may remember going back to Michigan State last year, heading into the game against my Huskies. I know it's hard to remember after the shellacking the Spartans just took at the hands of the Huskies. But last year, they also lost. And Keon Coleman looked really good on that side. Kind of like just, wow, this kid's going to be amazing if he continues to get this target level of targets, this level of snaps, transfers out, gets out of there, and yeah, he's going to be great. And I think he makes a ton of sense in 3 to 5 lineup range. You don't have to have like 20 plus to consider playing him. 6.7's obviously a hefty price tag. He did not have a single reception last week. That's going to scare people. They did get him a carry, which he didn't do much with. He even fumbled the ball, but I do expect Coleman here in a matchup against Clemson where they're going to have to score the ball. They're going to have to pass to really move the chains against a tough, environment against Clemson. Look for Keon Coleman to get back on track. He's probably going to score a touchdown. We'll look at anytime touchdown odds for Keon Coleman. They might be pretty damn decent. I like his chances of scoring a touchdown. They still have Jaheim Bell as well, sitting there at 4.6. 5 catches for 76 yards last week and a touchdown. Jaheim Bell has been fantastic. Sub 5K price tag puts him in play, but again, we don't really have to go there. It's kind of like Jatavian Sanders, our dude from Texas. Like he's in that value range the last couple of weeks at Texas on the slate, but we haven't really had to use him yet just because of DK's pricing being so awful. So I'm kind of just like to the level with these guys where they're luxury values, if that makes sense, but they're not must plays at this rate. So already taking too long on this game. I got to stop myself from continuing to jabber on. Let's move on to the next game here. PrizePicks would be awesome. Yes, I will certainly hit you with some PrizePicks. We don't have our guy Jake Kuchek to drop his PrizePicks heat, but there is somebody who introduced Jake to PrizePicks. So should have got him to sign up with my code, man. The way that guy plays, All right. Real raw. Let's move on here. Virginia Tech versus Marshall. This one is interesting. I feel like everybody's going to go obviously right to Rasheen Ali. He was super chalky the last time Marshall was on the slate. His price tag was stupidly underpriced. He's still sitting there at a fairly underpriced level at 6K. I think we can safely assume he's going to be one of the higher owned options at the position. You look at it, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to fade him. In the game against ECU in the first quarter and a half, he wasn't really getting a whole lot done. He had like 4 carries for 7 yards, and then he completely exploded. there's just so much usage that goes to Rasheen Ali, barring, God forbid, an injury. It just seems very unlikely for him not to pay off this meager 6K price tag. Yes, it's higher than 4.8, but he should probably be closer to, at this level, 8K before we even consider fading him. And as we get into conference play with Marshall, there's going to be just a lock and load situation, smaller slate showdowns. We're just going to be having to play Ali, because if you don't, similar to Marcus Carroll tonight, who's going to dominate Sunbelt games, you're going to find yourself just not making up enough points, fading him. So I do think we need to play him. When you look at the Virginia Tech games that they've played this year, let's pull this up. They haven't been very good against the run. Individually, in the game against Rutgers, was that, God, they looked awful, man. They looked absolutely awful. Kyle Monaghay, 143 yards on the ground, 16 carries, YPC of 9. That's healthy. You know, I'm a big YPC guy. 3 touchdowns on the ground. Gavin Wimsett even rushed for 87 yards and a touchdown as the quarterback, threw for 46 yards. They didn't have to throw the ball against Virginia Tech. They just continued to run. The Hokies could not stop them one bit. You go over and you look at the Purdue game, which ended up being awful for us because it was just weather continued to delay. Devin Mockabee did score against them, 95 yards. He had 21 carries. YPC of 4.5. That's still adequate. A lot of work there. We even saw Tyrone Tracy, who Purdue's been using a lot as a gadget type guy, rush for four times for 51 yards and a touchdown against them. The Virginia Tech rush defense is just not getting it done. And even in the game against Old Dominion, where they beat them 36-17, Grant Wilson rushed for 81 yards on 19 carries. Sean Wick, 73 yards on 14 carries. That is certainly good enough at 6K, either of those. And Ollie's not going to have to share. You know, he's going to get these 20-plus touches in some form or fashion. So this is a big DVP spot. I'm a sucker for DVP. We know that. I just don't see any reason not to use him in your main lineup. GPPs, you want to get a little different? Sure. We might use maybe the quarterback who's sitting there at 5.5, Cam Fancher. I see a lot of chatter about Fancher. I in that ECU slate, lots of people were kind of hyped about him. I don't really like that play at all. He does have the passing volume, which is nice. He does run a little bit as well. But you're really, kind of making a throwaway lineup here if you're playing Cam Fancher. And just for the sake, you're being contrarian for the sake of being contrarian, which I'm not a huge fan of. I like leverage. I like to be contrarian, but I like to have a solid reason why. And rarely a reason for me is just the sake to be different. If it makes sense, yes. If it's just to be different, I'm not that in love with it. Wide receiver wise, it's even more difficult. You do have Chucky Montgomery there at 4.3. He had a big performance in week 1. I don't think I would be messing with any of the wide receivers. And Marshall's just going to be able to give the ball to Ollie and let him work. He's going to be chunking it for 8 to 12 yards at a time. It's going to feel really, really bad if you don't use him. On the Virginia Tech side, it's pretty bad. I kind of talked myself into heading into that week 2 slate into Grant Wells when we had the Michael Pratt injury stuff going on, and there's just like too much time on our hands, overthinking. Now it's a situation where Grant Wells is under 6K. He has been practicing in as a limited participant, so we'll see what happens there. You have Kieran Drones also, probably getting the start, who's not awful. Did rush for 74 yards against Rutgers. Does have dual threat upside. Not the best passer, although he did drop back and throw it 32 times. So we'll see what happens here. They do have the dreaded co-starter tag. Not a situation I want to get into, but if you're running the 25 plus lineups, 150 lineups, whatever, I don't hate the idea of getting at least some exposure here. Wide receiver wise, the top 2 guys banged up. Ollie Jennings still probably a few weeks away from playing. That's not great. Jalen Lane, who is going to play, but also dealing with a hamstring issue, sitting there at 5K, going to be their main guy that gets peppered. Really not a lot to like on the Virginia Tech side. Rasheen Ali, or probably nothing out of that game. Moving on to the next one, Oklahoma and Cincinnati. This one, a 57.5 total. Marshall game was 41 total, by the way, so a little bit on the low side, right? Oklahoma 14.5 road favorites. This is an interesting spot. I was talking about Oklahoma, a few weeks back. Dylan Gabriel is that guy that nobody wants to roster, or nobody thinks to roster. He's usually over 9K, so he kind of, is a fringe play for people. They either want to go down lower to, an option in a better matchup, or they want to go up higher to a quote unquote sexier option. But all Dylan Gabriel does is go out there and produce. And you look at what he just did against Tulsa in a blowout situation, 66-17 win. He threw for 421 yards and 5 touchdowns. That's what Dylan Gabriel can do. And a lot of times he puts up these crazy numbers. Like there's been plenty of times when he's thrown for 250, 330 yards in the first half. It certainly dies out in the second half. There's a bit of a reputation for that in his Oklahoma tenure, but he is a big time force. Wasn't the best against SMU, at least in terms of yardage, 176 yards. That game was a little bit weird throughout, but he did throw 4 touchdowns, so still kind of saved his day. Also rushed for 20 yards, which he does have sneaky upside there, and will call his own number in the red zone goal line area. You saw in the first game where it was another blowout, 73-0, threw for 308 yards on just 22 pass attempts, 19 completions to get to 308. Has an absolute cannon, has weapons around him that can really burn down the field. So I like the Gabriel play. Again, another one where just kind of so similar to Jordan Travis, not a lot of ownership expected there. Somewhere in the region of 8 to 10% at most would be my guess. Cincinnati has that reputation as a tougher team, defensive, maybe make things a little bit uglier, but the total is higher, and the Cincinnati team isn't quite the same one from when Desmond Ridder was around. So I like Gabriel. Next question people are going to ask, can we run Gabriel naked if we run him? I definitely think that is the case, but there are some intriguing options. Let's pull up the target list here. So Oklahoma has been this way for years, and it's going to continue to be that way. Targets a little bit on the spread outside. Andrew Anthony leads the team in targets with 17, 14 catches, 254 yards, and a touchdown. That is your primary down the field burner. Then you have Drake Stoops, who's eternal. 16 targets, 14 catches, 126 yards, and 3 touchdowns. Jaquez Petaway, 10 catches, 61 yards on 11 targets. Jaleel Farouk, who happens to be a little expensive for his target share, 10 targets, 8 catches, 159 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Gavin Freeman, 5 catches for 16 yards and a touchdown on 8 targets. Then you still have my man LV Bunkley Shelton, still at the collegiate level, not with ASU, of course, playing with Oklahoma. Has 5 targets, hasn't been able to generate a whole lot with that just yet. If you are looking at the Oklahoma side, it is Gabriel and one of his weapons. I don't think we're in the running back game for them. In week 1, we all kind of liked Tawi Walker. He was cheap. We thought he had touchdown equity. He showed that, followed that up against SMU with 100 yards rushing. His price has come up to $5K. Don't love it because of the fact that Major is still getting work, right around 8 to 10 touches. And then, of course, Javonte Barnes is going to see double-digit touches as well. I'm not certain that I want to deal with any of these running backs for the Sooners. And then you saw in week 3, Gavin Sawchuk, who in a blowout got a lot of work as well. So I think for me, Andrew Anthony at 5'3" probably makes the most sense. Jaleel Farouk at 6'8" makes the least sense. That is just way too overpriced. I would love to see people chase that. Looking at what he did against Tulsa, that's great, but that's going to be probably more of a anomaly than the regular or the norm for him. I think Andrew Anthony has a better chance to be a little bit more consistent while still being able to break the game open, with big plays. You look at his yards after the catch, his reception rate, everything. He's really, really good. 18 plus fantasy points in back-to-back games. And regardless of a blowout situation, he's still putting up a high score. And 5'3" is still a fairly good score. And this is where I was kind of talking about with the Clemson receivers. Hey, man, they're kind of cheap, right? Bo Collins, 4'9", Antonio Williams, 5'2". Yes, but would you rather use one of those guys, or would you rather just play 5'3" for Andrew Anthony, knowing that the offense is clicking way better and Dylan Gabriel's certainly going to be looking his direction? So that's kind of where I'm DK pricing needs to tighten up, where Andrew Anthony, in week 7 will probably be closer to like 6'5", 6'8", 7K. Maybe he's the price of Farouk, where maybe he's not that great of a play at this 5'3" price, though. I'm certainly on board with him, and he is my favorite option to pair with Dylan Gabriel if you want to go that direction. On the Cincinnati side, Emory Jones is 6'9", You kind of know what you're going to get. If you've been playing CFB DFS or just watching college football in general over the last couple of years, you're going to know that Emory Jones is just completely inconsistent player. He will look like using this name lately, Johnny Unitas, for those of you who are old like me. And the other games, he'll look like John Kitna. If you as a tortured Seahawks fan for years prior to the Super Bowl, John Kitna, you'll know what I'm talking about. He threw down a gauntlet in week 1 against EKU, 345 yards on only 19 completions. That to me was like, wow, is this the new Emory Jones, or is this just like a 1-game blip? 5 touchdown passes, rush for 2 touchdowns. We're much more accustomed to seeing that out of him. You see the following week in a very tough, gutted out type of victory over Pitt. They should have played Christian Ballou. 125 yards, 2 touchdowns on 18 completions, only 17 yards rushing. Much worse performance, but still they got the win. And then a kind of not an embarrassing loss to Miami, Ohio, but probably an inexcusable loss where he threw 2 interceptions. 52% of his 34 attempts completed. Did rush for 101 yards and a touchdown. So to me, I think when Emory gets into trouble, and in a game like this against Oklahoma, where that line may not hold up at times, or guys can't get open, he's going to take off. So we're probably going to see some nice rushing upside out of Emory in this one. I'm not too keen on his ability to light it up and throw for 300 plus yards here. Not that he needs to pay off the 6.9 price tag. He's certainly a viable or interesting GPP option. Obviously, at 6.9, you got to at least consider him. But don't come into it thinking that he's going to throw 305 touchdowns, because that's just not going to happen, even with the higher total. He may rush for 100 yards and score twice, which is going to get the job done. But I'm very, very at this point, knowing Emory Jones and how he plays over the years, I'm not going to sit here and guarantee anything with him. So I'm a little bit underweight on Emory Jones compared to maybe what other people would be. He is an exciting player, though, for sure. Running back wise, Corey Kiner sitting there at 5-1 was really good against Pitt when they couldn't generate anything through the air. 153 yards, had a touchdown, 26 fantasy points there. Big game for him. He's getting a ton of volume. Already 47 carries through 3 games. Has a YPC of 6.1. I am a YPC fan. So I'm definitely, okay with him. I don't love the matchup here against Oklahoma. I think obviously there's better options. But again, if you're running multiple lineups and you need to kind of build out your player pool a little bit with some guys that nobody else is talking about, Kiner is definitely somebody to consider, because that workload is coming in there. And even with Emory Jones being such a high volume rusher as a quarterback, it's not really hurting Kiner, at least not yet. The top option there would be Xavier Henderson. Florida transfer, did have 12 catches for 140 yards last game. In week 1, 7 catches for 149 yards. Clearly a boom or bust option, 6'3". I'm not super excited to pay that price tag for him, but he does have that slate breaking upside. D. Wiggins is also there with Cincy at 4.4K. They get him a little bit of rushing work. He has been fairly consistent, 6 catches over 100 yards in his past 2 games. So somebody, if you need a little bit of value there at 4.4, but again, we only need a few hundred more to get some more reliable guys. We don't really have to go with the Cincinnati passing game unless we really are desperate for some extra lineups. All right, moving on to the next game here, SMU versus TCU. Definitely, if this was a slate without Colorado on it, this would be the one that everybody's clamoring to stack. You have a 63.5 total. You've got the total in Vegas high total guys that are like, you got to have this game. Just look at the Vegas totals, and that's how they pick their lineups. You're looking at a 6.5 point favorite for TCU, which actually seems kind of nice. I've heard people, on the SMU side, but I feel like TCU is like good for a 10-point win or more here. Certainly on both teams for DFS purposes. I have been a huge fan of Chandler Morris, since the beginning of the season and even beyond, really getting a chance to show that, hey, he beat out our guy Hacksaw, for the starting gig last year pre-injury. Things didn't work out, and look what kind of season Hacksaw had, but this is the guy who beat him out. and look at what kind of numbers he's putting up already. 68% completion rate on 109 pass attempts, already has nearly 900 passing yards, 6 touchdowns to 3 interceptions. Like to see that kind of be a little bit better, right? But he does have 150 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns, showing himself to be a definitive threat on the ground. He has thrown 30 plus times in each of those 3 games, and even 30 attempts in that game against Nichols, which was a clear blowout, overmatched. 26 of 30 for 263 yards, 2 touchdowns, still put up a 31 in a blowout. So regardless of the game situation, Morris is going to get his. The fact that he's continuing to churn out this rushing yardage with consistency, and it's not super sexy. He's not putting up 120, 150. He's not having that Emory Jones rushing game. He's not having the Jalen Daniels of last year rushing games, but he's doing enough to still put up these 30s, and he's almost doing it like somewhat quietly. Like, yes, people are talking about him as a play of DFS, but it seems like he's just continuing to go under the radar a little bit. And clearly everybody's going to go Bo Nix or Shedeur Sanders, right? And then Tyler Shuck, because everybody, Texas Tech, video game offense. So where does that leave Chandler Morris? I feel like he's going to be maybe not overlooked, but he's going to be way less owned than he probably should be. And that was kind of the case last week with him too. He definitely had some ownership, don't get me wrong, but I felt like he should have been a little bit higher. And if he comes in around like 18 to 20% this week, that to me still feels pretty low, even though there's 3-4 other quarterbacks that are going to be definitely in position to outscore him. You have to keep in mind, Chandler Morris is only 7'8". He should probably be closer to 9K with the production that he's given us. And this matchup against SMU that I think he should be able to absolutely detonate. When it comes to a pairing partner for Chandler Morris, I'm running him naked. There are some intriguing names in this receiver room. Like, honestly, there really is. Like JP Richardson, right? Dylan Wright's there when he's healthy. They got Jalen Robinson, who got just 2-3 years ago. Jalen Robinson, like, could not fade that guy. There's some really decent names in this TCU receiver room. But using them or getting them right from a week-to-week basis, even Jack Beck's, still the ghost of Jack Beck is hovering around there somewhere. It's just really hard to justify using any of them in a primary build. That's definitely an MME type of situation where maybe you cycle through those guys. You play Savion Williams, who at 6'3" is not really the best play, or you try to get a Jalen Robinson, or even like a Jared Wiley, who did look pretty good. I know he only had 2 catches for 14 yards against Houston, but he was involved quite a bit, and he looked actually quite good when he was on the field. Just didn't get the receptions. Really just running Morris naked, or if you don't want to play Morris, or you can't because you're like I said, focused on those other 3 quarterbacks, then I think you really need to consider Amani Bailey, who is another guy that has been coming in a little, besides week 1, has been coming in a little bit lower owned. 23 carries for 126 yards, 3 receptions last week against Houston, still only priced in the mid 6K range over on DraftKings. Definitely one of my preferred options at running back. And this is one of those situations in college football. It doesn't happen as often in the NFL. And that's something that people kind of have a hard time with when they come over and they got that NFL money. Let me see what college football is all about. They have a difficulty trying to justify playing a running back with a quarterback. And this is one of those situations where it can definitely work. Playing Bailey with Morris has worked and will continue to work. And we saw it work with TCU guys last year as well. This is the way that this team operates. So Bailey's going to get 20 plus touches. That's a guarantee. Morris is obviously going to get his passing touchdowns to random guys. He's going to run for that 30 to 50 yards, going to score a rushing touchdown. It's just not going to hurt Bailey really at all. So I don't mind playing both of them. Both feel a little underpriced to me, especially in this matchup where I'm expecting there to be a lot of points, not just because Vegas tells us so, but because of these offenses. So that's where my head is at on the TCU side. SMU, I'm seeing quite a bit of chatter already for Preston Stone. He's 7'4", so I get that. He's cheap. He did have a really nice game against Prairie View A&M. That's great. 5 touchdowns, 300 yards, but we're talking about on the road against TCU. And I know this TCU defense, maybe they aren't as good or dominant as they were at times last year, but they did just put the clamps on a Houston team, granted a way different version of Houston than we saw last year or the year before. And I know that they got blitzed and gave up a ton of points to Colorado, but since then, they really haven't. And granted, their week 2 matchup was pretty easy. So I'm not in a big hurry to sit here and play Preston Stone in my main lineup, especially if the rest of the field is playing him, because he is a little bit cheaper of that 7-4 price tag. But it's not that much cheaper than Chandler Morris, where I wouldn't just play him. Game stacks, you want to play both, that could make sense to me, but he's not being used over Morris for me, at least. The passing volume will be there, certainly. He still has plenty of weapons in the receiver room. Jake Bailey, who got hurt last year, was looking fantastic. Kind of figured he would come into it, be healthy, and be the WR1 for SMU, and I think we'll see him have some pretty big games this year. Looking at the target share for SMU, Bailey leads the team in targets with 15, 86% catch rate, 136 yards. Tight end RJ Maryland with 12 targets. Roderick Daniels, Moochie Dixon, Jordan Curley, and Romello Brinson all with 11. So SMU pretty balanced there with their target share around. But Bailey at 5.5 is definitely somebody that if you are going to use Stone, I think you absolutely have to pair him with one of his receivers. And there's a plethora of different options there for cheaper. But Bailey's the one that I feel is the best, and will, in a matchup like this, will kind of, rise to the top. When it comes to running backs, SMU they can't seem to get enough. They want all the running backs in the world. Now, Jalen Knight, was suspended in their last game. We have seen, Velton Gardner, who's, dealing with stuff. LJ Johnson is a game time decision. He's dealing with an ankle issue. Kamara Wheaton, I'm still banging that drum of Kamara Wheaton's season. He's, needs to be turned loose for good and give him all the carries, but that's just not going to happen in this backfield. And you still have last year's late season darling for SMU, Tyler Levine, kind of poking around here, not doing a whole lot just yet, but there's just way too many guys here in the backfield that are going to demand touches. So it's really difficult for me to sit here and say, yes, one of these guys is going to step up. And with the suspensions happening between Knight and Gardner and injuries, it's just we don't need to touch that. So really Chandler Morris and Amani Bailey are the two I'm going to come away from here. And if they're both under 20%, I'm feeling pretty good, because I do think the main way that people are going to go here is to jam in all the Colorado, Oregon, Texas Tech, and Rasheen Ali. Those are what we're going to be looking at in our opponent's lineups. All right, moving on here to the Auburn Texas A&M game. Just had somebody asking about that. A&M is a 7.5 point favorite, a total of 51.5. That's nothing to to shake off there. Certainly some points expected to be scored. Looking at the Auburn side, their offense has been a little bit unconventional to me. It's not what I expected to be. Thorne had a really nice game last week. Obviously, opponent-wise, we know why. Didn't look great against Cal. Didn't look great against UMass, but he has shown a little bit of rushing upside here for this Auburn team, especially last week. And that's going to be some element of his game, like he's, playing the Robbie Ashford role, who's still getting work, even though he's not the starter anymore. It does make Thorne a little bit interesting long-term, but certainly not this week at 8K. I did think ahead of the season that I was going to be all over Jarquez Hunter. Along with Trey Benson, Hunter was another name that every time somebody posted something on social media, like name your breakout running back, and all these, publications that were writing about running backs to watch for this season, Trey Benson and Jarquez Hunter, those are the names that were on there. And Hunter's just, not getting it together yet. Granted, it's very early in the season. Did have 11 carries in each of the last 2 games. I think that workload will continue to increase, but right now I just don't feel great about it with Peyton Thorne and the fact that Damari Alston is still getting, double-digit touches as well. And I think Auburn's going to continue to operate that way for a little bit. So Hunter needs to come way down. 6.9 is just not going to be a playable price for us. We're going to have to see him probably dip below 6K before we even consider it. But I do want to be early on him, and there is going to be a spot where we can use him. Just not so sure that this is it quite yet. Now, the Auburn receiver room is actually pretty nasty, and I don't mean nasty in like bad, but I mean nasty like your kids would say, very good. There are 3 options here that I have interest in for GPPs and for the long-term part of the season. Shane Hooks, Hollywood, if you will, 5 catches for 88 yards and a touchdown, 12 targets on the team here. Fully healthy Shane Hooks. He has a lot of pop. A lot of upside. I really like him. Somebody to kind of just keep an eye on. Jay Fair leads the team in targets with 20, 14 catches, 174 yards, and 2 touchdowns. And then Javarius Johnson, who hasn't quite got going yet, has caught 5 of his 6 targets so far. Somebody, again, to kind of keep an eye on. He had an issue to start the season. Seems like he's fully healthy now. Hasn't quite gotten involved, but he is a name that I want to keep an eye on. And again, want to be fairly early on. But we have that same situation like earlier with the Clemson guys where Hooks is 5'6", Fair's 5'1", Johnson's 4'9". You have Jair Shorter, who was, a transfer as well, and he was awesome in previous stops, but he hasn't been able to get involved just yet. And it's not even like we can take a shot at him. If he was like 3-2, I might be, looking for some GPP shares of him there. But at 4.8, they've just priced all these kind of speculative value guys a little bit too high, where I don't think we could justify using any of them, above Andrew Anthony, for example. So I do want you to be aware of Auburn, because I think there's going to be time here in SEC play throughout where we're going to be able to use these guys. And I love Shane Hooks. He's a really fun player, but we're going to have to wait on those guys for now. On the Texas A&M side, Wegman's still probably too high at 8-9. The volume's been there. That Miami game, I still can't believe that game turned into the stack of the slate. 53 pass attempts, which shows you that they're committed to this passing game this year. 337 yards last week, 336 yards the week before that. Has churned out 28 plus fantasy points in 3 straight games. Really looks good. The rushing upside is there as well. It does have 2 rushing touchdowns. Maybe I'm giving too much respect to Auburn, but this just feels like one of those more, physical games. I do think points are going to be scored. I think that the receivers in this game have an opportunity, but I just worry about overall upside for this particular game. Running back side, there's just a ton of names. The Amari Daniels show has been decent, but you look at his touches, they're not quite where they need to be before we would really proclaim using him. Moss is still getting double-digit touches. Reuben Owens is still a name there, getting double-digit touches. So we have to really be careful trying to use any of these Texas A&M guys. And thankfully, they didn't price them at like $3K to where we really had to consider them. So really, if we're looking at anybody, it is the pass catchers here for Texas A&M. And I don't think it's that bad of an idea to use one of them in your main, depending on the construction of your rest of your lineup. Evan Stewart has been an absolute target hog through the first couple of games here. Granted, this will probably slow down to a degree here as we get into conference play, but 27 targets so far. There's no worry. Well, it doesn't sound like there's any worry that he's going to miss this week. So I think he'll be back on the field the game against Auburn where they're going to need him. Look for him to jump right back into the mix and be heavily targeted. Week 1, 8 catches for 115 yards, followed that up against Miami, 11 catches for 142 yards. Clearly the alpha in this offense. And I thought Aniyah Smith was going to be more of an alpha. He's been on the team forever, converted from running back to wide receiver to, running back to tight end to combo this. And he's got the targets, does have 18 targets so far this season, 13 catches for 194 yards, but it's just definitely been the Evan Stewart show. 6'7", a price tag that I think people may shy away from. But again, we have all these kind of mid-tier prices we can look at. I think we'll be able to afford some of these higher priced guys that maybe they feel like they're priced out, but we can circle back the wagons and probably play them. Aniyah Smith sitting there at 5'4". It's not even like we're getting a big discount on him, and he only went off when Stewart was off the field. So that's a little bit worrisome for me. Noah Thomas, who had the crazy touchdown, week 1 performance, not too keen on him at 5'7" either. I still think Moose Muhammad has a ton of upside, even though people seem to have forgotten about him. So some good weapons here for this Texas A&M receiving. But I think Evan Stewart is really the only one that you can consider in your main. And ordinarily on a normal week, and when I say normal, I mean like pricing adjusted, we would probably avoid the 6'7", but I think we can actually afford it. So keep him in your player pool and maybe off to the side here as you circle back around. We're not starting our lineups with him, but you're going to have a higher priced receiver slot that you're going to be able to use. And I think Evan Stewart is fine if you want to go that route. Moving on to the next game here, we have Rutgers and Michigan. Michigan is a 24-point favorite, 44 total. Michigan, let's start with Michigan. This has been a frustrating start for DFS purposes for this Michigan team. Now, J.J. McCarthy is doing exactly what we expected. The first week, he was throwing the ball a lot more, honestly. That's not expected, but he's kind of leveled off, and as they've been blowing the doors off UNLV and Bowling Green, like he hasn't had to pass as much, and we're seeing him slide into that role where he's going to score 18 to 22 fantasy points, maybe 25 some weeks. He's going to have kind of that just semi-decent floor. You need a quarterback where you got a floor that's not going to bottom out. He's there. You could use him. He's fine, but I'm never starting my lineups with him. Kind of reminds me of like Sean Clifford. Maybe Clifford was better for DFS purposes, but like a guy that you were okay using as a QB2 if you didn't have any other options that really fit your lineup. Really, everyone cares about, myself included, is the running backs for Michigan, and I've been really wrong, I have to admit, very, very wrong on how I thought these first few games would play out for Michigan, and that I thought Blake Corum would get less work and be eased in. And I guess he kind of has, 10 carries in week 1, 15 carries in week 2, 12 in week 3, but he has just been a touchdown magnet. 6 touchdowns through the first 3 games. He only has 37 carries, 7 YPC. He's getting some receiving work, 5 catches for 28 yards. He has been the only Michigan running back worth, any bit of fantasy, relevance. Donovan Edwards, who sits there at 6'6", I got baited in the first week. He saved me a little bit when he got 4 receptions for 33 yards, ended up with 11. Still not what I wanted at 6'2". I backed off against UNLV. He was atrocious there. I've been just kind of waiting to see if things are going to pick up. He had 9 carries for 50 yards last week, no receptions. It just doesn't seem to be getting any better for Donovan Edwards. And with the injuries of these guys last year, it's actually gone the opposite of what I thought, where Corum would be eased in or really have the irrelevant games, and Edwards would be the one scoring these touchdowns or, punching it in a bunch of times, or at least putting together some 15 to 20 fantasy point games over on DraftKings. And that just hasn't happened. And I don't know how often we can keep going back to a Donovan Edwards without losing your trust. Like, I don't want to keep, trying to be the guy that can bang my chest and be like, we went back to Donovan Edwards for the 7th week in a row, and he finally hit. He scored a touchdown. We got 20 fantasy points. Let's go. But 6 weeks before that, we got 5 fantasy points, 6 fantasy points. I don't want to put myself through that. Certainly don't want to put you guys through that. So I think right now we'll go ahead and put Donovan Edwards on the sidelines and kind of take a wait and see approach there. If he busts out and goes crazy this week, that's fine. Maybe you want to have a GPP throwaway lineup just in case, but there's absolutely no way we can justify using him in our main. At this point, Blake Corum can be used anytime you feel like you have the salary or you're not messing with the rest of your lineup in such a way where the integrity, I like to say the integrity of your build isn't kind of, being called into question by putting Blake Corum into it, where you're having to severely weaken 2 other spots, then go for it, because he's probably putting up 20, and he doesn't even need, 10 to 15 touches to get there. He's going to score a touchdown. I probably should take a look at his anytime touchdown. Sure, it's awful. Probably like minus 700. He's going to score. He's going to get a couple receptions. He's going to have 8 to 12 carries before this thing gets completely out of hand. Rutgers has been improved, yes, but they're going into a hostile environment, I believe. Not even believe, I know. Coach Harbaugh is back in the mix. They're going to be fired up, and they're going to get smacked in the mouth. They'll be calling off the dogs there probably by mid-third quarter if we're lucky. So you're going to get the 20 to 25 fantasy points from Corum. It's just a matter of, do you want to pay 8.3? That's safety. Have you been burned so much by a running back so far that you just want those points in your lineup? I think that's fine, but be advised this slate is trending to be very high scoring because of how poor the pricing is. And it is better than last week, so good job, DK, on that. But it's still bad to the point where there's going to be a very high score. And if you miss in a key spot like this on Corum where he gives you 17 instead of the 30 you're really hopeful for, I just don't know if that's going to be enough. Like you're going to be fringe cashing at the end of the game, end of the slate. Maybe you have, let's see, maybe you've got a Carson Steele late, or, everybody has Colorado, Oregon. So you're getting those touchdowns, but it's doing nothing for you. You're still hugging that cash line, and you're just hoping that something is going to happen for you. Maybe you use Quinshon Judkins and you're like, man, do what you did against Alabama last year. I don't know. It just seems like it's going to be tough if you miss that first part. And again, I don't want to worry about game times, but Texas Tech plays late. Colorado and Oregon play late. These teams are going to have massive ownership, and it's just going to be tough if you whiff there. So I like Corum. I think he's fine. But at this point, I'm really, really sour on the Michigan running backs. And as a content in this space, somebody who really prides myself on being honest with you guys in full transparency, I don't feel like I have a very good read on the Michigan running backs right now. I don't feel bad about telling you guys that either. And I don't think anyone has a very good read on the Michigan running backs right now. I feel pretty in tune with a lot of teams already this season, but I just don't know if there's something still wrong with Donovan Edwards or what the deal is. Maybe with Harbaugh back at the wheel, we see some normalization of the carries and Edwards comes back into the mix, but I certainly don't want to mess around with it this week after missing on some running backs the last few. Roman Wilson, a show favorite, brand favorite, if you will. He has been an absolute revelation. He's somebody that we definitely hit on a few times last year, but never was he putting up these kind of numbers. Through the first 3 games, we're talking about some Tecmo Bowl, not even Madden-esque video game numbers, but some straight-up Tecmo Bowl. And if, again, I'm dropping these, you got to be a little bit older to know what I'm talking about, but 16 targets, 12 catches, 209 yards. 6 touchdowns. 6 touchdowns in 3 games. Clearly that can't continue, but I also didn't think that would continue after week 1. I didn't think that would continue after week 2, and I don't think that'll continue after week 3, but he is just cooking. Roman Wilson is completely unguardable, and anything that's in the end zone, you have to imagine with his equity right now and his target share that they're going to be looking to him. So I love Roman Wilson. Again, you look at how some of those fringe value receivers are priced, and then you come over here and you look at Roman Wilson at 5.5. Why would you ever take a shot on one of those like 4.8 Cincinnati receivers when you have Roman Wilson for less than 1K more with clear targets and touchdown equity? And again, the offense might change a little bit, or maybe we see the run game get going more, but we've been thinking that for the past couple of weeks with Michigan. Hasn't quite happened yet. So you have to think that Roman Wilson is going to continue his dominance, and they're going to keep looking his way. You have Corny Johnson there too, playing really well, 15 targets, 13 catches, 225 yards, just the 1 touchdown, but he is a deep threat as well. The name during the Big Ten previews that I talked about when referring to Michigan was tight end Colston Loveland. He had I thought he would have a stranglehold on the tight end targets. So far, he has 10 targets, 9 catches, 93 yards. Hasn't found the end zone yet for receiving, but that's only a matter of time. And like I said, he is playing a ton of snaps, and he is getting a lot of the work for the tight ends. And typically in this offense in the past, we've seen tight ends be pretty successful. So Colston Loveland is somebody to still keep on your radars. Is priced at only 3.8. We certainly have thrived in the past on low-owned, cheap pass-catching tight ends. Colston Loveland certainly is in the mix at 3.8, especially as kind of a last guy in. You need value. Maybe you wanted Roman Wilson. You couldn't quite get there, but you still want a little bit of exposure to Michigan. This is definitely a guy to look at. Target share is there. It's only a matter of time, like I said, before he finds the end zone. Might it be this week? Certainly a good possibility. Rutgers side, we don't need to really mess with them. There was a couple. It was that Rutgers game against Northwestern. Who was it? There was somebody that was like super chalky, and I was just like, what the hell? Why? I think it must have been Isaiah Washington. He's the only one that looks like it. He, I don't know, came into that game against Northwestern with like mega ownership, but none of the Rutgers receivers are in play. Montague just had that really nice, game, but there's a big difference from the Virginia Tech rush defense to at Michigan rush defense. So despite the fact that Montague has rushed for 140 plus yards in back-to-back games and has been solid throughout the season, I will let others use him there at 5-3. That's a no for me. And I do think Gavin Wimsatt is intriguing this season. Again, throughout long term, maybe there'll be a week where we can talk about using him a little more seriously because of his rushing upside, but we're not using him on the road against Michigan. He's probably in line for like a 2x performance, and that might be generous. All right, moving right along here past that game, super riveting, I know. Boston College and Louisville, 14-point favorites for the Cards. That's interesting for the Boston College side. 54.5 total. I do think there's a betting opportunity there for BC, who is offensively playing a little bit better than I think people realize, especially after that game. You know, they had the very odd loss to NIU. It was like, oh, God, how could that be? They were pushed to the brink by Holy Cross, but then they gave it to FSU, and it looked like they might actually win that one for a while. And the quick maturation and great play of Thomas Castellanos has been a big reason why. You look at the team, you would think without Jerkstore, Phil Jerkovich, who I think the only people at this point beyond, his family that love him more is DFS players. And we almost unreasonably think he's better than he is. But you look at how this offense is playing, and Thomas Castellanos is looking pretty damn good at 5'9". It's a type of play that I feel like is a little bit of a trap, maybe. It's that cheap quarterback, and I know it worked last week with Utah, but the matchup is pretty decent. He's getting the passing volume. He threw for 300 yards against FSU, is solid. The rushing upside is there. You look at 2 rushing touchdowns, over 230 rushing yards, 41 attempts there, over 640 passing yards, 5 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. I think at 5'9", Castellanos is absolutely in our player pool. And somebody that, if we want to get a little cheap, skimp a bit at quarterback, and there are some really good ones this week, I don't think that I'm considering him seriously over the other, the Morris, Nix, Shador, Tyler Shuck group. But if I can't fit some of the other options that I'm looking at and want, then yeah, I don't have any problem using him. Running backs wise, Garwo still has the questionable tag after missing last week. You saw Robichaud, who, really, I don't even know. Seems like he's been in college for a long time. He's been pretty decent the last couple of weeks. Did rush 21 times for 64 yards last week, 5'2". A discount in the middle part of the season, sure, but not right now. And then you have these pretty solid options. If you are going with Castellanos, I would certainly, even though he's a dual threat, look at pairing somebody with him. Now, pulling up the target share real quick, and they're, the BC receivers are all pretty cheap, all sub 5K. Lewis Bond and Ryan O'Keefe tied for the team lead with 18 targets. O'Keefe is somebody we expect them to really try to get the ball to at all costs. 15 receptions, 128 yards, no touchdowns through the air. Lewis Bond, 12 catches, 175 yards, 2 touchdowns. And then you have George Cox, the tight end that I actually like quite a bit. 11 targets. They're low-quality targets, just 3 receptions. 12 yards, but he is going to make a slate shatter at some point this season. I'm pretty confident in that. He does have the 1 touchdown. Joseph Griffin, 6 catches on 16 targets for 98 yards. And Jaden Williams still around, 4 catches on 10 targets, 105 yards, and a touchdown. So O'Keefe at 4.6, that's interesting. Somebody who has a pretty high floor, typically around at least, double digits, 10 fantasy points or so. They typically, they'll try to get him some carries, try to get him the ball any way that they can. So he's probably the preferred option, sure. But you have down here at 3.9, Lewis Bond, tied for the team lead in targets, does have a pair of touchdowns, 10 plus fantasy points in each of his first 3 games. So I do like him. And as a standalone option, even if you don't use Castellanos and you want to use one of these cheap BC receivers, this is a value that I do not mind. Those other values are semi-cheap guys that we talked about. Keep referencing Clemson. Not as big a fan of, but I do like the prices on these guys for BC. Jaden Williams is there at 4.3. Somebody to absolutely consider. Cox is almost min price at 3.4. Again, it's being heavily targeted. People that look at that or just, box score chase or look at the game logs on DK FanDuel, they're going to see 3 catches for 12 yards. This guy's not really involved, but he is quite involved in somebody that Castellanos is certainly looking at. And I think those numbers will improve quite a bit as the season goes on. And I just don't want to give up on him just yet. And he's somebody I've been tracking because there is going to be a time where we unleash him. And like I said, cheap tight ends is something of a calling card of the Super Show. So George Takacs is our guy for GPPs, at least right now. On the Louisville side, Plummer, our guy, Jack Plummer, he has a plethora of options around him. He has the type of offense to put up points, but he's just not a very appealing fantasy option. And at 7.5, I'd much rather go to Chandler Morris for a few hundred more or just take the more popular Preston Stone. At this point, it's really hard to trust Plummer. He's kind of turning into more of a game manager than I expected or would have liked to see him on this Louisville team. I expected more from him. I really did. And at this point, it's pretty difficult to get behind using him at that 7.5 price point. So with that being said, we can use somebody here on the Louisville side, but it's definitely not the quarterback. And I have to, again, kind of another one that I maybe didn't necessarily not see coming, but didn't see this level of success or efficiency right away with Joar Jordan. Does sit there at 6.5, which is a fairly decent price. I'm glad that they didn't make him like 5K or something. That would have been kind of frustrating. It needs to be up over 7K, though, with the way he's playing. Last week, another 113 yards to the board, 1 touchdown, 23 fantasy points. Saw the game against Murray State there. Only 7 carries, but 135 yards, 2 touchdowns, had a couple receptions. He has scored in each week. His touchdown equity is through the roof, and they are really feeding him the rock in really good situations or high-quality situations. And the line of Louisville is just doing a great job on running downs, especially. Jordan's he's hitting those holes hard, and he's just racking up yardage. 10.8 YPC so far, getting plenty of targets and receptions out of the backfield in the passing game. Certainly worth a look here against BC. It has I don't want to say a chokehold, because if you look at the usage and the carries, it's not like he's getting 80% compared to Guarendo's 20%, but he's certainly the first option out of the backfield. And in games that'll be closer, I do believe he will start to see that number go up. And if he continues to stay this efficient, if his touches, start to approach 18 to 20, there might be some really massive performances out of Jordan. But I do think he'll probably regress a little bit. I don't know that this is the Joar Jordan of the entire season, but absolutely in play at 6.5, even at that price tag, which probably feels a little bit uncomfortable, even though he's been so good. But if you need a running back who is at least not going to completely rip your heart out and put up 5, I think Jordan still qualifies for that. As far as the receivers for Louisville go, Jamari Thrash has been fantastic, and he's been super chalky pretty much every Louisville slate that there's been thus far. 21 targets, 14 catches, 329 yards, and 4 touchdowns. Next closest in targets is Jimmy Callaway and Amari Huggins-Bruce with 11. Only one other player over 100 yards is Kevin Coleman with 103. And only 2 other players have scored receiving touchdowns, one being that same Kevin Coleman, and then somebody, a name you might recognize, might even be surprised he's still around, in Joey Gatewood, who has caught a touchdown for Louisville. Thrash is 6'6". They've done a nice job pricing him there. He's certainly not priced out. He has been really good. I think this could turn into I've already started to write up the main slate. This is going to turn into a situation where if you had that money for a higher price receiver and you're looking in, automatically it's going to be, well, it's Weaver, it's Horn, it's, Franklin, it's these guys. Like, you could go to Stewart or you could even go to Thrash and I think be okay. Now, obviously the matchup, the game, the total isn't as sexy here, but anytime Plummer throws the football, more often than not, he's going to be throwing to Thrash. And he's just, so where the game maybe, lower scoring, he's still going to produce at a high level. He's still going to have his, 6 to 8 targets. He's going to get a touchdown, or he's going to have those opportunities in the red zone and even in the goal line area, they're gonna find a way to get him. He had a 12-yard carry for a touchdown just a couple of weeks ago. So at 6'6", I think Thrash is very much in play and probably an upper echelon elite GPP play, because even though people continue to play him week in and week out, I think that the allure of the Texas Tech, Colorado, Oregon guys, or even Miami for that matter, is going to pull people away from a quote-unquote less glamorous game. And Thrash is still Thrash and still going to get peppered with a ton of targets. Again, 21 through the first 3 games. He has been absolutely awesome. So I'm not jumping off the Jamari Thrash train just yet. Will he make my main lineup? Maybe not, but he's certainly going to be in some of my lineups, and I think it's absolutely foolish to completely fade him here. You got to find a way to get some exposure at least. All right, moving on to the next game here, Miami and Temple. Alex, you wanted some Temple coverage. You're going to get it. 23.5-point favorites for Miami. How are we doing on time? We're about over halfway. Long-winded, guys. What can I say? 23.5-point favorite for Miami, 48 total. That total will turn some people off, but I think that's a mistake. Miami, they're going to put up points, man. This Miami team, Tyler Van Dyke, who 2 years ago I really, really loved. I wanted my Seahawks to be in a position to draft him when he came out. Like, this was the guy I wanted to be the Seahawks quarterback for the next, decade, 2 decades, whatever. And then last year, man, the offense was just so porous. He couldn't get anything going, but it was obviously, and it's become even more obvious now, is less about him and more about the terrible play calling on the offensive side, because he's been turned loose here. The Texas A&M game really showed what he's capable of. 374 yards and 5 touchdowns. Clearly higher end there outcome. Not going to see that as often, but 250 and 2 to 3 touchdowns, I think, is going to be a relatively safe floor for Van Dyke throughout the rest of the season. And even going up against Temple here, where a likely blowout, you saw, against Bethune-Cookman, still put up almost 30 fantasy points, 250 yards, 2 touchdowns, had a rushing touchdown, which that's not something we can count on. But I do think we see him put up a big number. Now, he is 8'6", which is going to be harder to get to. Again, I don't mind exposure to him. I like his full season prospects, and there'll be times where maybe we can get to him at this price tag and maybe a more competitive game. But I certainly don't want to, again, completely fade him either. So that's somebody in our GBP player pool for sure, because I do think he'll flirt with 30 fantasy points here, but just how much over that is going to determine if he's a good player or not, right? For the running game, it's another situation where, man, Fletcher, banged up. If he is out, it doesn't really do much for us because Parrish, Allen, and Chaney's still going to get work. More competitive games, Chaney's going to see less work. We know that for sure, but this isn't probably going to be that competitive a game. So Chaney's still going to see 7 to 10 carries. That's enough to take from Parrish's plate. That's enough to, kind of water A.J. Allen down. Allen scored twice in their prior game against Cookman, but he could very easily just put up, 30 yards, no touchdowns. We can't really get involved with any of these Miami running backs. Instead, we're going to look to the receivers, which are really affordable. Even in a likely blowout, I think that Miami's passing volume is going to still be good enough. They're going to put up those points. Now, if, the Miami pass catchers were 7K or higher, I think would be like, yeah, it's pretty easy fade at this part, but they're just way too cheap. Restrepo at 5'8", Colby Young, who I love, sitting there at 5'4", and then Jacoby George at 5'1". Way too cheap for all of these guys. Now, Young, like straight up healthy and taking my shot. Price doesn't matter. To me, I think Colby Young's the best receiver on the team. I know a lot of people will argue, well, it's, Jacoby George, touchdown scoring machine. Xavier Restrepo is a much better, route runner. Like, I get all that, but just like pound for pound, Colby Young is the best receiver on this team, and I really, really like him. I think we saw in that first game, he got banged up and missed a bunch of the first half and third quarter. He looked like the best player in the field, and I think he would have had like 10 catches for 200 if he hadn't have gotten banged up there. He was on pace to just go completely ham. Looking at it here, I think we see a lot of Restrepo ownership, and probably the highest owned of the three will be Jacoby George, just because, he's the cheapest. He has that touchdown equity. rolling through the targets real quick. Restrepo has 21 targets, George 19, Young 18. 4 touchdowns for George, 2 for Young, 0 for Restrepo. Yardage-wise, Restrepo 314, George 202, Colby Young 208. Again, Young missed some snaps, missed some time because of the early season getting banged up, and still putting up equal or better numbers than some of these guys. I don't really have a preference for which one to use. I just think we want to use one of them. And they're, I don't know if we're going to be able to get them in our main lineup. This might be one of those rare, super rare weeks where we actually use a wide receiver in the flex. Actually physically pain me to suggest that, but I do think it's viable. I think running 2 running backs only this week is viable. But man, it's painful, right? But I think that 5-1 Jacoby George, like that's probably better than a lot of the running backs on this slate. Like it's Jacoby George, or maybe it's like somebody, 6-3 for Carson Steele, who's good. Don't get me wrong, but I don't know. I just feel pretty good about these Miami receivers. And I feel like the wide receivers have been, at least this point in the season, producing at a more consistent level for us. And that's just the nature of the game. I think the way the direction of the football is going anyways, and also the lack of bell cow running backs that we're seeing. So I'm kind of, the house of 4, as the CEO of the house/church of 4 running backs. I know it hurts my conglomerate of folks to even suggest playing only 2 running backs, but it is on the table here. George, probably the best play of the 3. I obviously like Colby Young. Maybe he's a little more suited for GPPs, but I mean, he's really good. I think he's got an opportunity to be the highest scoring of the 3, but I think George sees the most ownership, followed by Restrepo and Young. So do with that what you will. Okay, Temple side. We've got some plays here. We have some plays here. Now, we're not using any quarterback. We're not 5-1 for EJ Warner. Like, yeah, that's pretty cool. He's gonna, he's had a couple of games where he threw 40 plus times against Rutgers. He threw 48, only 11 fantasy points. So that kind of scares you. But what's nice about that is there's going to be passing volume. He's not going to do a whole lot in terms of completions, but he is going to connect on a few. That's really all we need for some of these wide receivers. I'm just going to kind of go right past the running backs. We'll circle back around. Now, this receiver room has some pretty remarkable names that you might recognize. Dante Wright, who's sitting there at 4-4. Colorado State fame. Ahmad Anderson is still around. He was Purdue a couple of years ago. Ian Stewart, who hasn't, been able to play. There's just some good pass catchers here. And if they had a better quarterback throwing them the ball, I think more people would be looking into and talking about this Temple group than they probably will. And I do think we have a little bit of sneak here that we can get away with. Now, Dante Wright at 4-4, probably the most obvious for anyone paying attention if they have, followed college football for any length of time, or, knows how good he flashed or showed himself to be in the past when he was at Colorado State. Now you'll look at numbers, 2019, he was almost 1,000-yard receiver. Now he had some injuries, 2020 season, what it was. And did finish up 2021 with 43 catches, 500 yards, and 3 touchdowns, which is moderate. But again, Colorado State had some ups and downs coming off the COVID year. Didn't really get much action last year before transferring. Since coming to Temple, though, he has been a target machine, which is especially true in week 1 against Akron, which sets up to have a lot of passing, passing volume in a similar way to this Miami game does. He had 14 targets against Akron, 9 against Rutgers, and then just the 4 against Norfolk in a lesser game. That would be the one where I'd throw that out and not worry as much. Now, the yardage hasn't been there, 83, 59, and 47, but the PPR work has turned 9 of those targets into receptions, 5 of those 9 targets, 3 of those 4, again, 9 of those 14. So far, 17 receptions for 189 yards and a touchdown, but a team leading 27 targets. So he is getting absolutely peppered. We are getting a cheap, viable value play at 4-4, which is, again, there's a kind of a logjam of guys from 4-2 to like 6K that are kind of, varying degrees of intrigue to me. But Dante Wright at 4-4 is certainly, borderline main team viable for me because I do expect there to be a lot of passing volume. And I do think he gets a lot of that PPR work, short yardage stuff. And he's probably not going to turn anything into a big gainer against this Miami defense. But, I'll take 6 or 7 receptions for 80 yards. If he scores, even better. But he's certainly a guy who I think for single entry, cash games, head-to-heads, all that good stuff, even high dollar, I think you can get away with using him. Ahmad Anderson, second on the team with 21 targets, 11 catches for 180 yards. He can be used as well. Zay Baines has 18 targets. Now, this is where you're getting into all those incompletions that Warner's throwing. He has just the 6 catches, but has been targeted 18 times. So there's that. David Martin Robinson, the tight end, 9 catches on 16 targets. And then you see the running backs, Edward Sadie and Darvon Hubbard, with 8 targets and 6 targets, respectively. As far as the running game goes for Temple, I would probably not advise you to get too cute there. So far, Joquez Smith through 2 games, 24 carries. Edward Sadie through 3 games, 21 carries. And Darvon Hubbard, 18 carries through 3 games. Now, Quincy Patterson, this is a CFL offense where, backup QBs come in and score rushing touchdowns, has 3 rushing touchdowns. So that further complicates things if you are considering a running back from Temple. Not the best idea. Now, Joquez Smith is listed as the starter for Temple this week after being a backup there for a few. I guess, did enough against Norfolk to impress and want to do some things there. So maybe people will be tempted to use him. I'm okay with it if they do. I still think Sadie will see work. He's been decent in the past, but again, you're really kind of just being different to be different with this Temple team. And if you're looking at their running backs, I think you either have too many lineups in the can or you're just bored. So Dante Wright is the guy from Temple. You wanted some Temple coverage. You got it. That's your play at 4-4. Moving right along here to BYU and Kansas. This one here is an 8.5-point spread in favor of Kansas, 54.5 total. For the Kansas side, it's become a situation where Jalen Daniels maybe not as playable or auto, if you will, as he'd been last year. Now dealing with, Nixon banged up and all this stuff, it's been a little bit difficult for him. The passing volume has been there, and he's completing them at a pretty high percentage, 75% completion rate, 575 yards, just 2 touchdowns and interception, only 20 rushing yards, which that's the big thing that could be worrisome, maybe because of, the injuries and the other stuff and the distractions, if you will. Maybe he's just, not having those opportunities to run. Also, Kansas has a couple of running backs that are really, really good. So Jalen Daniels' overall upside feels way less than it had in the past. Doesn't mean he's not a play. If you're using him, it's in GPP though, but I just worry about his upside. He's just not a main team play right now. Certainly still a guy to keep an eye on. Can't completely ignore him. Now you have my dude, Devin Neal, who is our Mr. Anytime touchdown. Not going to get great odds on him anymore. Coming into the game against Nevada, it was thought that he may miss that game, or at the very least he was banged up, wouldn't be getting as many carries, and that Highshaw was going to play more. And we had Highshaw in some lineups on that Nevada-Kansas slate, and he did score, but just 9 carries because Devin Neal said, the hell with that, I'm playing, and he did tote the rock 17 times, 89 yards, and 3 touchdowns. He also caught a 59-yard pass. That is what makes Devin Neal so intriguing. He makes huge, huge plays. He turns something out of nothing. And as far as his receiving goes, he just, I don't know how he does it because he doesn't look like he's super elusive when he's out there. But when you get him out in open field and he makes a catch, he almost always turns it into a big gainer. He is really, really good out of the backfield as a receiver. And at only 5.9K, it just seems like, why would I use Jalen Daniels, who I like, when I can pay sub 6K for Devin Neal? And if that is something that doesn't quite sink into you, let's go over to FanDuel, everybody's favorite site, and let's pull up the price tag on Devin Neal. And granted, the way the lineups are constructed from site to site are different. So the pricing, 11K on FanDuel isn't 11K on DraftKings. Doesn't quite mean the same thing. But he's 11K on FanDuel. That's some huge sticker shock right there because he's a good play. A good play is a good play regardless of the price. But on FanDuel, it's wow, 11K, that's a lot. But you look at him on DraftKings at 5.9, getting a little PPR work, got the touchdown equity, which you do love over on FanDuel, and it's just crazy. I think most people will see that because that is something that people do look at. In the past, they didn't, but people start to look for pricing discrepancies from site to site, of course, and they're going to see that Devin Neal's blatantly mispriced at 5.9 to the level at this of a couple weeks ago when Rasheen Ali was, 4.6, 4.8, whatever. It's probably on par with being that bad. Through 3 games on 40 carries, he has 303 yards, 7.6 YPC, 8 receptions for 131 yards, 6 touchdowns, 5 rushing, 1 receiving, 16.5 yards per catch. Devin Neal is just a big play, dude. And if you can throw his anytime touchdown, which again are probably going to be awful odds. We had it 2 weeks ago at -170, which even that I was like, you got to throw that in a parlay or something. But he's just about a lock to score a touchdown every single week. And I don't know that BYU is going to do anything to stop him. Now, if he ever were to be limited, they have a backup in Highshaw or even maybe like a 1B-ish to his 1A, who's really good too. And Highshaw has scored in all 3 games as well. Has an impressive YPC of 7 himself, 175 yards on 25 totes. This running game is really quite good. And they got a chance to, back in week 1, see Savion Morrison. There was talk if Neal missed that they would play more Morrison. I think he's kind of just there waiting if somebody gets banged up. And they have Dylan McDuffie as well, who in the past, has been pretty decent. So this running game is really strong for Kansas. That's where I would hone in. Receivers wise, kind of similar to the Miami situation where all of the main options are below 6K, between Lawrence Arnold, Luke Grimm, Quentin Skinner, sorry. They're all fine plays, but because of the fact that Daniels hasn't quite risen to the level that maybe we're accustomed to seeing, they're a little bit lower end to me than the Miami guys, even though the secondary of BYU will cede some yardage and the point total will probably be higher for Kansas. This is a game that has a potential to really shoot out. I don't have that much interest in the Kansas guys compared to Miami. So take that for what you will. I feel like the Kansas receivers are last guy in type plays. And since we're not using Daniels, we don't have to feel obligated to maybe, try to figure that out or force them in. If you want to have some clarity with targets, you won't get it because they're all within one of each other. Skinner, 15 targets, Arnold and Grimm with 14. So very, very balanced attack there. Only 1 touchdown amongst the 3 because Devin Neal and Daniel Highshaw keep scoring all the touchdowns. BYU, there is news we want to monitor for this weekend. Aiden Robbins, who, if he were to play, yes, 4 or 5, we know what Robbins is capable of, but doesn't appear to be progressing as well as they need him to. I don't think he ends up playing. We'll see if he does play. It's gonna hurt us for DFS, but it might actually work out for the best because everybody's going to use LJ Martin if Robbins is out. If Robbins plays, people might feel inclined to use him at 4 or 5 because it's so cheap. But let's say he's banged up, he's 70%, and he just plays enough, gets snaps or gets enough carries to hurt Martin to the degree that both of them end up off the optimal. That's probably the best case scenario if you really want to get into, outworking your opponent. But if you want a nice little cozy Saturday morning when you wake up and see, oh, Aiden Robbins is out. Okay, well, we're playing, 70% on LJ Martin. Okay, cool, got it. Sitting there at 4-9, Martin was fantastic against a tough Arkansas opponent. How they beat Arkansas, I just never would have guessed. 23 carries for 77 yards. That's not great. That's a YPC of 3, but that's a lot of work. Did have 2 receptions as well, scored twice. He's sub 5K. I mean, you're going to give me a dude at that price getting 20-plus touches without Robbins. Yeah, it's going to be hard not to use him. And going up against Kansas, It's not the most ideal spot on the road, but he just showed us that he could churn out the yardage. And if he does get those carries, we'll take another 75 yards and a touchdown or two, obviously. So we'll have to monitor that news and see what happens. If Robbins plays, then it gets a little trickier. Deion Smith, I think, is just kind of there. I don't foresee him really mattering too much. So if Robbins is out, Martin, look for him to get a lot of the touches. Quarterback, I'm not huge on Kadon Slovis. Feels like he just keeps trying to go to a program to see what he can do. He hasn't looked that great to me. Threw for 350 and 4 in week 2 against a very weak opponent. So do what you will with Kadon Slovis. As far as the BYU receivers, been saying this for years about Isaac Rex, but he's just like, his touchdown equity is incredible. He only has 1 touchdown this season. I get it, but it just like, here, let's pull up Rex, because seemingly on DFS slates, he ends up being a touchdown god on very few targets typically. Let's see. So the COVID year, 2020, 12 touchdowns on 37 receptions. He had 6 last year on 22 receptions, and then 3 in 2021 on 18 receptions. So he has a very high touchdown upside on his receptions. It doesn't matter who's the quarterback for BYU. They're typically looking in Isaac Rex's direction. He has been a very consistent option for years for this team, and actually leads the team in targets this year with 21 so far. So very highly used tight end for this BYU program, and he's super cheap at that price of 4 or 5. Definitely usable. We haven't seen Keanu Hill too well yet. Chase Roberts, who was a DFS darling in the first couple of weeks last year, has been solid. 13 catches for 138 yards, 2 touchdowns on 19 targets. Darius Lassiter has stepped in as kind of like the second or third option, 10 catches on 17 targets, 141 yards and a touchdown. Him coming in, it was expected for him, after being on Eastern Michigan last year as kind of a third fiddle, I guess, to come in and be kind of a higher used guy. And so far that's been the case. He was completely shut down against Arkansas though. So that's a little bit concerning before you kind of plan on using him. But he's definitely going to be a guy, I think, throughout the season when BYU's on some of these, secondary slates that we're talking about using. And eventually our guy, Cody Epps, is going to be a slate breaker type option. He is going to be available and ready to play, dealing with a nagging hamstring. Cody Epps was quite solid last year and somebody that we were able to use against that Chase Roberts chalk. So I do want to keep my eye on Cody Epps, but we're clearly not using him this week. All right, moving on. Texas Tech versus West Virginia, and we got to go faster. Must go faster. Texas Tech 6-point favorites, 55 total. Now, Tyler Shuck, he's likely going to be a popular option. I don't mind it. I don't hate it. He's usually a guy that I am looking for a reason not to use, but they did maybe biff his price a little bit there, sitting at 8-1. That's certainly a appealing option there. West Virginia definitely has the opportunistic D at times to maybe give him some trouble. We did see him get picked off against Oregon 3 times, and Oregon's defense doesn't scare me all that much, but he did have 101 rushing yards in that game, which did surprise me actually quite a bit. This Texas Tech offense, again, high passing volume, video game-esque numbers, fast pace. So that's why you're going to see that ownership on Shuck typically. I don't mind that as a super flex play. If you don't play 2 quarterbacks from the Oregon-Colorado game, or, Castellanos from BC, I think Shuck is perfectly fine. And like I said, I think we see a lot of ownership there on him. So I don't mind that one bit. The Texas Tech running backs, typically Taj Brooks sitting there at 5.7. It's just an okay price for me. I'm not super keen on him. Seems like, again, everybody's wedged into that price point. Now, when it comes to the Texas Tech receivers, there are a myriad of options, and that's pretty typical. It was last year. Let's pull up the target, see what we can kind of figure out from that. I think looking at the price tags, Miles Price at 4.8, that might be an appealing play where we see a little bit more elevated ownership on him just because of that. Dre McCray sitting there at 4.7. Then you have Duran Bradley at 5.9, who's a little bit higher price, but still cheap enough at sub 6K that he'll certainly see some ownership and has been fairly good for this team of Texas Tech, and somebody that Chuck has been able to lean on to a degree. 29 targets through 3 games, 17 catches, 211 yards, 2 touchdowns. Price 12 catches on 20 targets, 118 yards, 3 touchdowns. Dre McCray 7 catches on 11 targets, 82 yards. Hasn't scored yet, but we know how good McCray was last year for Let's Go P. And then Jordan Brown 8 catches on 12 targets, 124 yards, and a touchdown. So really, if you're running multiple lineups, you're just rotating through. Jordan Brown, he's 3-4. His targets are high, but most of that came against Tarleton. So I don't know that I would be fooled by using him necessarily, especially when you have Fuanji, Mason Tharp, Sparkman still there. There's a lot of different options here to use. I think if you're using any of them, you find that money for Bradley, who is going to get targeted, or you take that slight discount with Miles Price. I think either one of those guys is your main team pairing partner if you want one with Shuck. And then your GPP option is Dre McCray, who we know has a ton of talent and is going to get going here. Eventually, there's just a lot of mouths to feed for this Texas Tech team. West Virginia side, we're not using quarterbacks from them. CJ Donaldson is my guy. I like him. 5.9 is a fair price. Typically a jack of all trades type guy. Hasn't been getting it going as a receiver just yet, but did have 18 carries against Pitt. That was encouraging. They kind of grinded that one out, 102 yards and a touchdown. 18 carries in week 1, despite the fact that they lost by double digits against PSU. 81 yards and a touchdown there. And then in the blowout, game against Duquesne, he wasn't needed. Still had 13 carries, 56 yards. He'll be a factor. I'd like to see him get some receptions, factor in a little bit more there. Maybe a little bit priced out for us at 5.9, but this matchup against Texas Tech is certainly prime and good enough for him to maybe fly under the radar a little bit and put together a pretty high score, and one in which I think, people will look back and be like, oh, why didn't I consider CJ Donaldson? Wow, he has 25 fantasy points. What happened here? So I definitely like him as a GPP guy for sure. The wide receivers, can they get Jashawn Polk going? Can they get Devin Carter going? Perhaps. There are some names here for West Virginia, but I think it's just pretty much Donaldson or bust for them at this point. Nobody in the receiving game that I'm really looking at. Cole Taylor's there at 3.9, but I don't want to get that cute here on this particular slate. Let's go to UCLA. We have a string of Pac-12 games here. UCLA versus Utah. 4.5 point favorites for the Utes. I like the UCLA side for what it's worth. 52.5 over under. Now, at this point, Utah, they play games. We know that they did give us the reports on Nate Johnson early last week, which was surprising. We're supposed to get this Cam Rising. Let's see. It wasn't before the show. Let me see if I have missed it. Cam Rising status remains uncertain. Wow, what a surprise. What a surprise. Utah saying that they were going to make a decision by Thursday. What a surprise. Utah QB Cam Rising on his weekly radio spot on ESPN Radio, Salt Lake City. Okay. It's been going good. I'm feeling as good as I felt since getting hurt. I'm definitely getting that feel. Shut up, Cam. All right. Cool. So we won't know until Saturday. I'm not shocked to be hearing that. That's typical Utah fashion. He's not playable at 9.3 anyways. And Nate Johnson's not priced at 4.5. Praise DK for that. At 7.9, he's not really that interesting to me either. He has that rushing upside. We know that, but he's playing a UCLA team that can certainly stuff him in a locker here. I don't like it. It's to me, I don't really need to follow it that close. It's definitely news to check on, especially if you're running multiple lineups, but it's not a slate determining decision like it probably was last week. The same deal with the Utah running backs that I say every week, Jaquin Jackson, who really didn't get it done last week. 9 carries for 69 yards after putting, a huge number, 130 yards on Baylor the week before. He's 6'1". We just, Jalen Glover's going to pilfer work. He had 12 carries last week. Glover, that's something we said last week. Like Glover's going to take work. Curry's going to take some work, and he did. He had 6 carries. Like, it's just not a very good situation to get into. And Utah remains, for me, Brant Kuithe or nothing. Kuithe is sitting there at 3-4, begging to be played the moment we get word that he's good to go, cleared. Let's do a quick Brant Kuithe search here. I really intended to do the show in like 90 minutes today, by the way. I really, really did. But if there were odds on that, it was probably like minus 900 that wasn't going to happen. Kuithe's still questionable. Okay. From what I've read, it sounds like he's not going to play. They're really banged up. Pittman, Vele, all those guys just like beaten to hell. I don't think that we really need to mess with any of the Utah guys. Again, if Kuithe were to play, he's super cheap that I would want to have exposure to him. We know how good he is. They use him in the running game. They use him in a myriad of ways as a pass catching combo tight end. I love Brant Kuithe, and I will certainly be looking to use him when he's back, but we're not there just yet. On the UCLA side, the kid Dante Moore, he's pretty damn good. I don't think he's getting enough credit. Kind of the same trajectory, of Dorian, DTR. He's, not the most gifted passer yet, but the upside is there. He's super raw. You can tell, like, as the seasons go on, we're going to be using Dante Moore a lot. And I think he will become a certifiable dual threat guy as time goes on. He's showing already pretty masterful control of this offense. I kind of like the option of using him there at 6'2" for GPPs. He's cheap enough to do so. He has a good offense around him, and he is throwing for a decent number of touchdowns through 3 games. He's already thrown 7 touchdowns, so very, very comfortable there. Certainly not a main team play. And then at the running back spot here for UCLA, Carson Steele, who came over from the MAC, Ball State, sitting there, really has been pretty good in this offense. He's getting plenty of receiving work. Scored a couple of touchdowns through the first 3 games, 30 carries, 250 yards roughly, YPC over 8. He's good at 6'3". I don't mind it. TJ Harden is a no for me, even though he's been pretty solid. He's pilfering work, but it's not enough to play him at 6K. Does have touchdown equity, but if you're playing one of the UCLA guys, you might as well just find the few $100s more to go to Steele, just because that work's going to be more consistent. But Harden's obviously in the mix there, and GPP-wise, there could be stranger things happening than Harden outscoring Steele. But Steele would be your main team guy if you're using somebody from that group. J. Michael Sturdivant sitting there at 6'4". A little too pricey, I think, because of the fact that Moore is still finding his footing. We saw, Sturdivant went completely bonkers against Coastal, very quiet against San Diego State, returned to form, 2 catches for 60 yards and a touchdown. I just don't think he's going to see enough PPR work or enough receptions to really be viable at that price tag. I would much rather use somebody, like a Cam Brown, who's sitting there at 4.3 perhaps, but he's not that interesting to me either. Maybe a Kyle Ford, who does have upside, hasn't quite showed it yet. Rather just use Carson Steele or nobody for the UCLA side. All right, now we get into the last trio of games here. Colorado, let's save that game. We'll get into Ole Miss and Alabama because everybody wants to talk about Colorado, right? Ole Miss versus Alabama. The total on this one, 55.5. Not bad. 7-point favorites for Alabama. I think at this point, Alabama, for DFS purposes, quarterbacks are a no. Jalen Milroe, getting back into the starting spot after Ty Buck did really nothing against USF. That was a very ugly game. There was so much ownership on Alabama because a lot of people expected Bama to explode. I thought they would score more points, but I didn't like them for DFS purposes. You had Ty Simpson there seeing some work. It's all bad there for quarterbacks right now for Alabama. And it's really kind of hurt the running back situation too, because until those guys can figure it out and really throw the ball with any consistency, and make defenses worried, the running game's just not going to probably find too much room. And Jason McClellan at 6'2", that's too high for him right now. We did see 17 carries out of Waddell Williams last week. He looked really good. Might he start pilfering Jason McClellan more? Good chance that happens. Jam Miller, who I thought would see more carries last week, didn't. So you don't have to really worry about him too much. Roydell's there at 5'9", not a huge discount from anyone else on the slate, but certainly the more appealing running back at this point for Alabama. Might that last performance earn him more work? Probably does. Like Jermaine Burton overall, but my gosh, can you really pay 6.6 for him? Couldn't pay 7.1. He had just the one reception for 7 yards, victimized by that poor QB play. So it's very tough to get behind using any of the Alabama guys. You do have Kobe Prentice, who again has shown upside in the past, but then disappears because of that poor play. You have Isaiah Bond sitting there at 6K. He's looked like the most consistent option, but again, how can I justify using any of these Alabama guys? Instead, I would really want to go over to the Ole Miss side, where, the whole, Alabama is going to be pissed. They're looking to just, completely destroy. Ole Miss is in trouble. I don't know that Ole Miss is really in trouble. I think at this point, Ole Miss can handle Alabama. I think we're sliding away a bit from dominant Clemson teams, not necessarily sliding away from dominant Alabama teams, but there was a time where Alabama football was just okay, right? And I'm not saying that they're just okay now, but they don't have an identity, and I don't know how they got to a point where they don't have a quarterback either, but they're going to have to rely on their defense. And I think Ole Miss, Lane Train will have some work here for Bama and put them in a blender. Jackson Dart, just huge rushing upside, just completely blitzed Georgia Tech, 136 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns, 42 fantasy points, a very high level elite GPP target at 9.2. Again, nobody will be looking to use him because of the reputation of Bama, but he can absolutely put up a 40 spot here. I have no doubt in my mind about that. The running back situation, our man Judkins, who going into the last Ole Miss slate, it was talked like, hey, Bentley's the guy. We didn't get the reporting very well. Judkins ends up playing, rushes 13 times for 37 yards, does score a touchdown, has a couple receptions, not a very big game, but the fact that we didn't get that news until after lock was frustrating because most of us use Ulysses Bentley. Thankfully, he scored and rushed for 61 yards on 6 carries. Bentley can go back in the box, though, at 5.7. We don't have to worry about using him. The decision really would be, do you want to pay up 7.7 for Judkins, who hasn't quite justified that upper tier price tag just yet, hasn't quite got going. And a lot of that is the cliche sophomore slump. There's a year's worth of tape on this kid. Defense is keying in on him. There's a lot here, and we're not seeing the same level of efficiency for Judkins that we saw last year. He's also not got a buddy in the backfield like Zach Evans anymore. However, that keying in on him has really helped Dart become, like I said, an elite option. He's running all over the field. He's making throws. Even though the receiver room of Ole Miss is completely banged up, we are yet to see Zachary Franklin, although it does appear he's closing in on returning. Sounds like maybe a few more weeks, but Franklin playing, that's going to be huge. Trey Harris, who had completely destroyed the first couple weeks of the season, he hasn't really been practicing. He's been very limited, so we're probably not going to see him. Caden Prescorn, still another week away, it sounds like. We have seen Jalen Knox, who played in the first week, but then he's been out. So all these various options that they have just haven't been available, and that's been tough for them. Prescorn returning is going to be a big deal. I'm going to be using him in his first game back, so please believe. So really it leaves Jordan Watkins, who really smashed 4 catches, 119 yards, and a touchdown at 6'5", and then Dayton Wade, who was super cheap last week, kind of that secondary option to Watkins, even though he's only 3.8. His price bumped up to 5'3", 3 catches for 86 yards. They did give him a couple carries, so they're using him in a myriad of ways. You have Michael Trigg there as well, who was solid in the first week. Didn't do much last week. So I think there's some other situation going there where he missed snaps. This whole Miss team is a mess, but I do think they're capable of beating this Bama team. This might just be a spot where I bet Ole Miss and stay away, but I want Jackson Dart shares in my GPPs for sure. Judkins, I'm on the fence about paying 7.7 for him. Nobody else will, which makes him intriguing. But I don't know. I need a win with these running backs. All right, Maryland versus Michigan State. Maryland's 7.5-point favorites, 52.5 total. Michigan State just got their doors blown off by the Heisman candidate and likely the true Heisman king of the world, Michael Penix. If you disagree, you simply just don't watch enough football. Going up against this Maryland team here, it's a nice little bounce back spot, I think, for the Spartans. Shout out to Jamie, one of our community members in the FTN CFB Discord, kind of calling out that, the Maryland offense, it's just stagnant. The coaching staff on the offensive side, for lack of a better term, sucks. And we've just really seen Talia struggle. He has weapons in the receiver room, and we're seeing 30 plus, pass attempts per game. He's got that volume, but it's just not quite working. Did throw for almost 350 yards against Virginia, but they had a really slow start to that game where Virginia kind of, jumped out on them. And then defensively, the Terps defense has been really quite good. And they've been able to kind of gut games out for Maryland to the point where the offense, they haven't had to be relied upon too heavily just yet. Roman Hemby has been a touchdown scoring machine. He did have 162 yards against Charlotte, but other than that, he hasn't really been that great in terms of yardage. The blocking hasn't been there. It's just been a really good Terps defense showing out with a lot of talent. Now, this receiver room, again, very, very good. Jashawn Jones, Caden Prather, Ty Felton, tight end Corey Deshace, who's cheap again, Tyrese Chambers, if he's ever going to be fully healthy and ready to go. Like, there are some good looks here on this Maryland team, but they've been priced up super high. Sean Jones at 6'5", that's going to be tough for me to get behind. I know he put up a 21 against Virginia, 596-1, but that's just asking way too much. The Spartans defense has been decent and is actually probably as good as the media said last week. They're just, you're facing a Heisman winner in Michael Penix. It's not hard. It's not easy for defenses to handle. Probably a little bit easier to handle somebody like Talia, who's good, but he's not Michael Penix. I mean, who is, right? So I think this Maryland pass catching group is probably a fade, except for Corey Deshace, who, 3.8 a couple weeks ago in Charlotte. That was a great price for him. He was good value on that secondary slate. His price ballooned up to 6'3". That wasn't as good. Now he's dropped back down to 4.7 after 4 catches and 56 yards. I'm fine with that. I think he could potentially score a touchdown here. I do think Talia will look to him a little bit more than those other guys in this game on the road as kind of a safety valve. So I do like Deshace as a potential main team play value. But otherwise, Maryland guys, I'm off. And I'm not even looking at Roman Hemby, who has crazy touchdown equity. I don't think the 7.9 price tag really calls to me too much. The Michigan State side, not on Noah Kim, 7.7. No thanks. I'm off that. Nate Carter at 6'2 is at least playable. The volume is there for him. Looking at it, Jalen Berger has not been healthy, likely not going to play. And Nate Carter is going to continue to get 15 to approximately 20 touches. Did rush for back-to-back games of 100-plus yards, got stifled by the Huskies, but still had 17 carries, got a reception, was still looked at there heavily. I think he gets back on track here against Maryland, even though, again, I said that Maryland defense has been pretty good at times, and they've done quite well. I do think Carter's volume does make him at least a viable option at 6'2" if you want to go that route. Not having Keon Coleman around in the receiver room is tough for the Spartans. You do have Trey Mosley there at 5'9". Not the greatest. Montori Foster, who is still very oddly chalk one year that I still can't quite figure that one out. And then you have Fitzpatrick there at 4'2". It's a value piece, but otherwise not a very exciting game. All right, let's go to the game of the slate where everybody is going to be super hyped about this one. The level of interest, I got to give it to Prime, man. The level of interest he's been able to bring to the Colorado football program, college football in general. I mean, there's, Little Wayne is at Colorado games. I mean, it's wild the hype that Colorado's getting. I got to give it to him, man. This is going to be a fun one. Looking at it, it's obviously a 7.5 total. 21-point favorites are Oregon. People are going to be looking to stack this in a multitude of ways. Both quarterbacks, triple stacks, running backs, every run back that you can think of. There's going to be a lot of stacks of this game. So it won't be too contrarian to, all of the large field GPPs. People will just run a multitude of things. So let's just get into who should be on your radar, who you should be looking to play, and then maybe who are some of the lesser owned guys that we can look at. Starting with the quarterbacks, Bo Nix, it's crazy because a couple of years ago when I worked for a different company, I rode the Bo Nix train when he was at Auburn. I was one of the only ones in the industry that still believed in Bo Nix. He hurt me bad many, many times, but I stuck with it. And now he gets to Oregon and he just puts up some phenomenal numbers last year, talked about as a big-time Heisman candidate. And now he waltzes in here at almost 10K and is absolutely playable, could be the highest scoring player on the slate, and is main team viable at almost 10K. It's crazy how life can come at you super fast in a good way and sometimes a bad way. But Nix so far this season, 893 passing yards, 8 touchdowns, 0 interceptions. That's been the big thing, going from the SEC to the Pac-12. He's been able to cut down on some of those turnovers that plagued him during his time at Auburn. Now, he's only rushed for 60 yards so far, no ground scores, which is a bit odd considering that he did pile up over 500 yards last year and 14 touchdowns. But that element of his game does still exist. He did rush for over 200 plus yards in each of his last 2 seasons prior to last year as well. So it's not as if he's not a dual threat anymore. I just think that the passing game has improved. Bucky Irving has been incredible, and he hasn't had to really run the ball just yet. Now, he does get a matchup against this Buffalo's defense that is very forgiving on the ground, giving up over 260 yards per game through the air and over 190 yards per game on the ground. So almost 500 yards of total offense. We know that we're going to be able to stack against Colorado often, for and against each and every game. But everybody else at this point knows that as well. Now, you look at some of the performances early on against Colorado. Chandler Morris scored 3 touchdowns against them, 2 passing, 1 rushing. He was solid, 279 yards through the air, rushed for about 30. A good game for Chandler Morris. Now, the week after that, everybody thought, got to play Jeff Sims. He's cheap. Let's play Jeff Sims. Going against this Colorado team, let's do it. Now, I was very leery about it. We talked about it for a long time on the show. Jeff Sims is Jeff Sims. He wasn't very good. He did score a rushing touchdown, but he was not very good. Throw that one out because Jeff Sims is in a category all of his own. Last week against Colorado State, a very violent game pre, during, and post. A lot of trash talking going on, but Braden Fowler Nicolosi, 367 yards, 3 touchdowns, a very, very monster game for him. Definitely changed my view of him. I think during conference games this year, Braden's actually going to be much more playable than I thought he was. But again, he gets that Colorado boost. So with Morris and Fowler Nicolosi having such big games, what do you think that Bo Nix is going to do against them? I think inevitable 300 plus passing yards at minimum, right? 3 passing touchdowns at minimum. And he's probably going to rush 1, maybe 2 in. Like the Bo Nix for Heisman campaign, it's not gotten off to a good enough start on the ground to really probably keep him in the mix just yet. So he needs a marquee game to put himself back in the popular vote of people who actually have a say in this and to get the media talking about him again. And what better way to do that than against the Colorado Buffaloes hype machine and Deion Sanders with the team that is missing arguably their best secondary defender in Travis Hunter. I won't sit here and entertain him being the best receiver on the team because that's just not the case. I know a lot of people say that is and making a big deal about it. He is very, very good. I don't know why I'm coming off as a Travis Hunter hater in my Discord. I'm not trying to, but not having him around obviously hurts the defense even more. And a lot of that had to do with the Colorado State game in the second half when they just couldn't stop anything. So Bo Nix is going to get an opportunity to put himself back on the Heisman train here and just unleash a huge game, whether that's uncorking 400 plus passing yards, or he rushes for 150 yards, or he scores 7 touchdowns, something ungodly like that. I feel very, very confident in Bo Nix. I think that I'm okay paying the 10K for him, even considering he's probably going to be super chalky this week. This would ordinarily be a spot where I'd be looking to fade. I'm uncomfortable with the price. It's Bo Nix. Let me get away from him. But I just have seen too much from Bo Nix at this point. Watched him for a lot of his career. And I think, granted 3 games isn't very much, but we can tell they're going to play a brand of football that just yields a ton of points. And Bo Nix thrives in that situation. So we got to play Bo Nix, guys. A way around Bo Nix, and this is a situation where you can play a running back with a quarterback if you want, but Bucky Irving at 7.5, that feels a little probably too low. I almost feel identical to how I felt about Imani Bailey and Chandler Morris. The price on those two is relatively too cheap. Bucky Irving, wasn't really needed against Hawaii. Still had, 15 touches or so. Texas Tech, 38 yards on the ground, but he did score a touchdown, had 7 receptions. That's what you got to love Bucky in the PPR game. He just factors into the passing game so much that even if he isn't churning out yardage from the ground, he's typically getting a ton of passing work. So he can put up 30 without putting up 100 rushing yards. So you got to love that. The touchdown equity is there. Touchdown equity is there. So 7.5 is a fair price for him. Honestly, feel like he should be up over 8K. Now, the wide receivers, which are going to be spendy, that's where it's going to get probably a little bit tougher. And again, the wide receivers on this slate are quite good. I can definitely get down with playing 4 of them if you find yourself going that route. Troy Franklin leads the team in targets with 25, 17 catches, 292 yards, 3 touchdowns. Tez Johnson, who has been magnificent himself, 11 catches on 16 targets, 155 yards, and 3 touchdowns. And then you have Gary Bryant, 11 catches, 13 targets, 159 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Bucky Irving's 4th on the team with 12 targets. Just know he's going to get a bunch of touches. So basically probably comes down to, do you want to just pair him with Bucky and you're going to get that PPR work plus the rushing work? I think that's viable. Do you want to go with the Troy transfer, who has been fantastic so far and every bit as good as we thought he would be in Tez Johnson? Certainly think that's viable. You look at Tez's price point here, sitting there at 5.9. It's a 1K discount from Troy Franklin. I think that's certainly worth it. I think the ownership will be way higher on Franklin just because we know Franklin's going to get peppered. You're going to have that salary. Probably Franklin is the guy that people are going to use over Jamari Thrash and over Evan Stewart. I think either of those guys could outscore Franklin still, even though this environment's incredible. And an extra bit of leverage is just playing Tez Johnson over Franklin for that 1K discount, because I don't think Franklin's going to outscore Tez by a metric S-ton, as they say. I think Tez is still going to score like 15 to 20 fantasy points. And as long as Franklin doesn't drop like a 40 spot, we're in good shape at that 1K discount. You could even go further down the list with Gary Bryant, who has had some strong games himself, non-existent against Texas Tech. More of a GPP look there, but at 5K, you can expect targets to come his way. And Treshawn Holden is still floating around there. He did have 463 and 2 touchdowns against Hawaii, sitting there at 4.8. The targets for Holden haven't quite been there to the level of those other guys. 8 targets, but he has caught 7 of those. And again, 2 of those 7 have gone for touchdowns. So Holden is in the mix as well. On the Colorado side, Shedeur Sanders, gotta look at this at 9.5 and think this is your best bit of leverage for this game, because I think people will struggle to fit both Bo Nix and Sanders. That's going to be awfully difficult. I think what we see is Bo Nix and Tyler Shough together. That's what you're going to be staring down the barrel of in your head-to-heads and your high dollars and your single entries. Sanders is just naturally going to be on that lower owned spectrum from those guys. Still going to carry ownership, of course, but just far less than those guys. So this is your best way to get into a situation where, yes, Sanders is going to throw for 350 yards. Yes, he's going to score touchdown upon touchdown. Maybe he gets me a rushing touchdown. Maybe I don't want to deal with the pecking order of Colorado and all these various guys. Although I would recommend, if you go Sanders, that you do obviously play one of his receivers, and it might even be ultra contrarian to play 2 of them with Sanders, whether that's Weaver and Horn, or you go down and find, who's going to absorb some of those Hunter targets with him being out for the next few weeks, or even going to a guy like Dylan Edwards, who still at 6.7 is very highly priced, but did show out in a huge way in that week 1 game against TCU. and you look at his receptions, he's still catching a ton of balls. 6 receptions last week, 3 the week prior, 5 before that when he had that 135 yards, 3 touchdowns. Stupid, crazy game that obviously was a top 1% outcome. 6-7 is a lot of salary to put into it, but again, that is another good way to find some leverage in a game that's going to be stacked in a multitude of ways. I think Dylan Edwards and Shedeur Sanders are going to be on the lower owned end of this game compared to everybody else. It's going to be tough to find Edwards, especially with the talk of Alton McCaskill possibly getting into the game here. I don't know that he'll see enough work to matter, but McCaskill sitting there at 3.8, he might see enough work to hurt Edwards as a rusher, but Edwards will still factor in as a receiver. So that's what the end game we're looking at for him. 9.5 is a tough price to pay for Sanders. Now, we have been on it with Xavier Weaver. He has been phenomenal. Everybody and their mother chased on Horn the week against Nebraska. We were able to get to Weaver, and he put up a huge game. Now the secret's out. He followed up that 10-170-1 performance with a 9.98 and a touchdown performance against Colorado State. Heavily targeted each and every week. He now is tied for the team lead with 32 with Jimmy Horn. 386 yards, 2 touchdowns. Horn, 246 yards, 2 touchdowns. Now, Hunter had 16 catches for 23 targets, 213 yards. No touchdowns there, but just being out on the field, of course. Dylan Edwards, 14 catches on 17 targets, 160 yards, 3 touchdowns. Tight end Michael Harrison, who was a one-man wrecking crew in the second half, 11 catches on 13 targets, 113 yards, and 2 touchdowns. CSU had no answer for him. He's okay. I don't think we see him have quite as big a game. The receivers to potentially look at with Hunter out, Tavarish Dawson, who has 11 catches on 12 targets, 110 yards, and a touchdown. He's really somebody who is somewhat intriguing. He is priced up after last couple of games, sitting there at 4.6. He did have a touchdown reception against Nebraska, 3 catches for 41, but clearly somebody who's going to slide in there and be a part of this high-volume attack, and is cheap enough at 4.6 to get some exposure to this game without completely breaking the bank if you're still looking to get a guy like Thrash or some of these other options that we've talked about throughout. Still like Weaver the best. If you're gonna gun to the head, which receiver of those two are you using? I'm still on Weaver. That's no longer contrarian. It's probably more contrarian to use Jimmy Horn instead, who's also been great. But I just like what Weaver gives us in terms of target share, touchdown equity. Just when you watch the games, he runs really clean routes. He just seems unguardable, honestly. So that's my guy still, and I'm finding that salary for 7.2 to play him for sure. More so than I am Franklin on the other side. And I don't know, I just have this issue with Oregon wide receivers for some reason, so I have trouble getting down with that 6.9 for him. I'm much rather pay for Weaver on the other side and either go down to Tez or just play Bucky Irving and hope that he catches 7 or 8 balls, which I think he may. So that kind of wraps up that game. Play everybody, but Shedeur Sanders might be our ticket to a low-owned, high-heat type of game. But looking at the quarterbacks, it's really Bo Nix, Shedeur Sanders, Tyler Shuck, or Chandler Morris. I think 2 of those 4, and Dylan Gabriel kind of on that fringe GPP spot. Core, let's get into the core here. Still ran the normal time. Tried my best. Bo Nix, I know, not very exciting, but you just got to lock him in and walk away and try to figure out your next move, because he's just really going to put up some ridiculous numbers. Rasheen Ali, I know that's boring as well, but 6K, they didn't adjust it. And then at wide receiver, this is where it kind of gets a little fun. There's a variety of options here that we can use. I don't think I feel married to any one receiver here. Again, there's a multitude of guys, but I think Xavier Weaver is probably the core look that we want. Now, plugging those guys in, let's do this real quick. All right. So that leaves us with an average of 5.4 per player after that. We can work with that, especially even if we plug in the clear-cut RB2 next to Ollie, Devin Neal. We can still work with that. Might be tough, and that's where it's like, okay, how owned is this Colorado-Oregon game going to be? Because they did do a nice job of pricing it up. And you're certainly not playing Sanders with Nix. That's just not going to happen. So you're going to have to find some of these uber cheapies to make it work. I do think we have some leverage opportunities here. But for the most part, we're moving in the right direction for pricing, where guys can't just mindlessly click in all the best guys at, super cheap price points and move on. So that makes me feel pretty excited. I do want to monitor the BYU news for Aiden Robbins. And I do want to monitor Alton McCaskill news, because if McCaskill ends up playing and at 3.8, I don't know that Prime, I don't know if Deion Sanders will just like work him back in slowly. I feel like they'll just be like, here you go. Here's the rock. And like if Alton scores twice, I mean, at 3.8, you're just punishing people who didn't have the testicular fortitude to go in that direction. So we'll see how that works out. But there's a ton of other cheap guys for Colorado that you could potentially use. Harrison there if you think the tight ends continue. Dawson, who I think might end up being relatively popular if people can't fit in all these various high-priced options. This slate looks to be quite fun. Dante Wright, though, is I don't know if he's a sneak. I want to call him a sneak, but I feel like there's going to be enough time elapsing where people are going to catch on to that one. But Dante Wright feels like our sneak. On FanDuel, let's get a core on FanDuel going here. Now, Bo Nix is 12-2. Dylan Gabriel's 10-7. I actually like the idea of going to Dylan Gabriel there slightly on FanDuel because I do think he can score, can keep up and get a close enough score there. So I'll core Dylan Gabriel over on FanDuel. Devin Neal, just crazy 11K. My top running back on FanDuel is actually Amani Bailey at 9-2. Love my guy Amani. And then at wide receiver, it'd be nice to just say, yeah, Malik Neighbors, who's 10-5, let's get him in there. He's a beast. Marvin Harrison, like that's not going to do you any favors. There are some very expensive options here on FanDuel. Makes it pretty tough. I like the price going up against Baylor, even though I don't really like using him. Xavier Worthy of Texas at 8.5 and Kobe Hudson of UCF at 6.6. So I will core a cheapie there for you on FanDuel in either of those guys, but I will lean Kobe Hudson at 6.6 for now. Let's go over to PrizePicks. We'll mosey right on here. We don't want to run too long. See what the updated numbers are. So I love the pass plus rush combo yards. Have done pretty well with that. Bo Nix is extremely high at 341.5, but he might just throw for 400 yards. He might just rush for 150. And I mean, it just seems very, very unlikely he won't hit that. So over 341.5 passing plus rushing yards for Bo Nix. Over 308.5 passing plus rushing yards for Chandler Morris as well of TCU. I am heavily involved with Chandler Morris this weekend. One of my favorite plays of any slate. And then let's go to if I really want to get crazy, I'd take that Braylon Allen under, but we won't go that route just yet. Amani Bailey over 86.5 rushing yards. Very confident in him. Rasheen Ali over 102.5 rushing yards. He's going to get a ton of work. And then, of course, Jake's guy here, Ray Davis. They've got him at 97.5 rushing yards. He seems like a mortal lock for 100-plus rushing yards as well. So we will go with him. That is, I think, what we'll end with on PrizePicks. Let's just double-check our receptions number, see if they give us anything we can work with here. All right, that's a good one. Current receptions number for Miles Price against West Virginia, 4. over 4 receptions, 4 miles price of Texas Tech. I will take that one. Feel pretty good about that one for sure. And then Devin Neal over 0.5 rushing touchdown. Dude's never going to not score a touchdown, so I'll just take that every single time. And then let's go over to our anytime touchdown props over on DraftKings, and we'll end this, and then we'll just double check, make sure nobody has any final questions. Oh, they are giving us a ton of anytimes. Dang. All right. Xavier Weaver, minus 105 anytime touchdown. I'll take that. Jimmy Horn, plus 105 anytime touchdown. I'll take that. Considering Bucky Irving is like minus 305. So they're giving us some value there. We'll certainly take that and run. Judkins is is only minus 225. There was a couple weeks ago where he was like minus 700. Pretty wild. All right, Devin Neal's anytime touchdown is up to minus 285 now. I still like it. Obviously, you're going to have to throw it with something else, but I'm just going to keep rolling it out there until he doesn't score, which doesn't seem like it's going to be coming up anytime soon. Do like the bit of value with Arkansas at LSU, minus 205 anytime touchdown for Jaden Daniels. I'll take that. That just seems pretty easy. He's going to score a rushing touchdown against them. Very certain of that. Let's take a look at the current passing yardage here. One more prop. I just wanted to double check the passing yards for one player here. Might have changed, so I want to give you Dylan Gabriel, over 253.5 passing yards. It's minus 135. Pretty tasty to me. I don't see him going under 300 here. It's just going to be too much volume going on the road against Cincinnati. So give me the over 253.5 passing yards for our guy, Dylan Gabriel. All right, we did it. Soloed it. 2 hours. Sorry, if you're watching this on demand, make sure you use the speed up function. Sounds like my voice is getting a little froggy, so we'll give that a day to calm down and get better. And then we'll be back Saturday morning, 8 a.m. PST, 11 a.m. EST, 1 hour before a lock. We'll kind of bring together any last-minute news regarding BYU running backs and also any inevitable last-minute or out-of-left-field news that drops, lineup questions. So be throwing those at me, or any questions at all, strategy-wise, betting stuff, prize picks, anything. We'll load up those questions and get those answered live on the air. Again, 1 hour before lock this Saturday, and then within the next 12 to 15 hours, you can expect 2 pieces on the FTN bet site from me, 3 actually on the DFS side, so FTN Daily, and a lot more coming. It's only week 4. And we're less than a couple months away from college basketball starting as well. So if you're a fan of college sports, giddy up. We're about to hit our absolute best time of the year. I don't care what people say. As we get into the overlap of college football and college basketball, it gets very fun. And of course, as we get into March, that's the best. But if you're a college fan, this is it. Appreciate the continued support of everyone. Tons of you paying attention and giving the show likes, comments, all that good stuff. Appreciate it. Take care, guys. We'll see you back here Saturday morning for another edition of the CFB Super Show. Take care.